Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are walking into the household of Queen Charlotte. Not the throne room, not the coronation. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Not the public face of the monarchy, the private machinery, the women who dressed her, attended her, raised her children, kept her secrets, and sometimes, quietly, suffered for the privilege of doing so. There was a rule at her court. No one sat in the Queen's presence. Not the duchesses who served as her ladies of the bedchamber, not the women who had attended her for 20 years, not the gentlewoman who had been working the dressing rituals since dawn. You stood. You stood through the morning. You stood through the afternoon. You stood when you were tired, when you were ill, when your feet ached, when your stays were cutting into your ribs. You stood until the Queen sat, or until the Queen left the room, and then, only then, were you permitted to sit yourself. Women fainted. Frances Burney described stretches of standing so long the strength left her legs. Some women lasted a single season and resigned. Some endured for 30 years. The pay was modest. The work was punishing. The privilege was beyond measure. To serve the Queen was the most prestigious post a woman could hold in Britain. It was also one of the most miserable, and the women who took those posts often had no real choice in the matter. Tonight we are going to meet them. We are going to meet the Duchess who arranged Charlotte's hair beneath the crown at her coronation in September of 1761. We are going to meet the German lady who arrived with her at 17 and was still running the household at her death 57 years later. A woman hated by every English servant she had ever known. A woman inexplicably loved by the Queen herself. We are going to meet the governess who raised all 15 royal children, and who in her spare time invented the educational jigsaw puzzle. We are going to meet the young sub-governess who received hundreds of love letters from a 16-year-old prince, kept every one of them, and handled the whole affair with an act of restraint that should be more famous than it is. We are going to meet Frances Burney, the most celebrated novelist of her generation. She walked into Buckingham House at 34. She walked out at 39 with her health broken, and a diary that still shapes every account of this court ever written. We are going to meet the daughters who called Windsor a nunnery. We are going to meet the daughter who almost certainly bore a child she was never permitted to name, and we are going to circle, slowly, toward the question the household asked in private and never resolved. The question of why the Queen loved the woman at the centre of her household whom no one else could bear. We are going to find out. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you, whether you are here to drift into sleep or to walk through the rooms of Charlotte's household beside the women who served her. I am glad you are with me, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. It is September of 1761. The yacht is called the Royal Charlotte, renamed in honour of the woman she carries, and she has been at sea for 10 days when she should have 3. The North Sea has held her. Storms that would not break, winds that would not turn, a sky the colour of pewter for an entire week, and on the deck below the captain's cabin, a 17-year-old girl who has not been able to keep food down since they cleared the harbour at Cuxhaven. She is the new Queen of England. She has not yet met the king. Her name is Sophia Charlotte. She is the youngest daughter of the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a small German principality on the Baltic that almost no one in England has heard of. She is here because George III, 23 years old and 3 months on the throne, has chosen her for his wife. He has chosen her without meeting her. He has chosen her on the recommendation of his envoys, who have travelled across the continent assessing the available princesses. They reported back that Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz is plain, healthy, intelligent, Protestant, and unlikely to make trouble. George has read the reports and approved the match. The portrait that arrived with the recommendation showed a thin face with intelligent eyes. He found it acceptable. The negotiations were concluded. The yacht was sent, and the girl on board the yacht has spent her 10 days at sea trying to learn the English alphabet from a chaplain who is almost as seasick as she is. She speaks no English. She is being sick into a basin held by one of the 2 German ladies she has brought with her. The basin is emptied and brought back. She is going to marry a man she has never seen and rule a country whose language she does not speak. And she is going to do it within 48 hours of stepping off this boat. And she is 17. She had left Strelitz on the 17th of August. The departure had been a long, careful thing arranged over months by her brother, the reigning duke, and supervised on the day itself by her mother, who was already a widow and who would never see her daughter again. There had been a final dinner. There had been the small farewell concert that the family had arranged, with the young court musician playing the harpsichord, and Charlotte herself singing the part she had been learning since the spring. There had been the gathering of trunks, the careful packing of the linens she would take with her, the inventory of the small private books she would not be parted from. The library at Strelitz was modest, but Charlotte had selected from it what she most loved: a volume of German hymns, a small French testament, a book of botanical engravings that she had pored over since she was 12. The trunks had gone ahead of her in the wagons. The carriage that took her out of the gates of the castle on the morning of the departure had carried her through small German towns where the people had stood in the streets to see the princess pass, and they had thrown wildflowers, and they had cheered, and her mother had sat beside her with a face that did not move. The journey across the continent had taken weeks. From Strelitz the carriage went to Stade, where the British envoys met her formally, and the escort that would take her to England joined her party. The roads of North Germany in August were dry and dusty. The inns were modest. The people who came out at every village to look at her were respectful and curious, and a little, perhaps, in awe. A girl on her way to be queen of a country. Half of them had heard of only as a place that wars were fought against. Charlotte travelled with a small entourage. Her 2 German ladies, who were her oldest companions, a chaplain who was to be her spiritual director until an English one could be appointed, her hairdresser, her dressmaker, the various small officials who had been chosen by her brother to attend her until she was safely delivered. They reached Cuxhaven on the 28th of August. The yacht was waiting. The wind was wrong. They waited 4 days at the harbour for the wind to change, and on the 2nd of September they set sail, and the wind changed again within hours of their departure and turned, and the yacht had been struggling against weather ever since. The 10 days at sea were the longest period she had ever spent in a single confined space. The cabin she had been given was the captain's ceded to her by virtue of her rank, and it was small enough that she could touch both walls when she stretched out her arms. The bed was bolted to the floor. The single window, which the captain had assured her would give her a fine view of the open sea, was shuttered for most of the voyage against the spray that came over the deck in the heavier weather. The light in the cabin came from a single oil lamp swinging on a hook, and the swing of the lamp described, for 10 days, the slow heaving rhythm of a ship that could not find the wind it needed. Charlotte had brought her books. She tried to read them. The motion made her ill. She tried to learn the English alphabet from the chaplain. The motion made him ill. She tried to embroider a small piece of work she had begun in Strelitz. The light was too poor, and her hands were too unsteady. She tried in the end to sleep, and the sleep, when it came in fragments that lasted an hour or 2, and were broken by the ship's bells, and by the sound of feet on the deck above her, and by the small dreams of 17-year-old girls being carried away from everything they have ever known. She was not in despair. She had known, from her early teens, that she would marry a foreign prince and live in a foreign court. She had been prepared for it, as her sisters it, by the careful instruction of governesses who had taught her the languages and the manners and the small religious certainties that a princess of a small German house was meant to carry into her marriage. She did not think, in the cabin of the Royal Charlotte that she had been wronged. She thought she was tired and sick, and she thought she would be glad when the voyage ended, but she did not think, in any deeper sense, that the life she was being carried towards was the wrong life. It had been chosen for her, and she had accepted it, and she was, in the small, careful way that she had been trained to be, ready. The Royal Charlotte was meant to land at Greenwich. The storms have made that impossible. The captain, on the morning of the 7th of September, makes the decision to put in at Harwich instead. The news is sent ahead by fast rider. The women who have been waiting at Greenwich for 3 days are now tearing through the Essex countryside in carriages that were not built for speed. There are 2 of them, and they are the first of the women who will define Charlotte's English life. The Duchess of Ancaster, mistress of the robes, the senior lady of the Queen's new household. She is 43 years old. She has been told to dress this child, crown her, and present her to the country as the Queen of Great Britain. The Duchess of Hamilton, Lady of the Bedchamber, formerly Elizabeth Gunning, one of the 2 Gunning sisters whose extraordinary beauty had carried them 20 years earlier from the obscure Irish gentry to the highest peerage in the kingdom. She is 30 years old. She is the woman the court has chosen to be Charlotte's first companion in her new country. Both women have been waiting on docks and in inn yards for the better part of a week. Both women understand that the next 3 days will determine whether the new queen begins her reign with allies or with a wall. They reach Harwich in the late afternoon. The yacht is in port. The girl is on land. She is shaking. She has not yet recovered her balance from 10 days at sea, and the ground beneath her feet still moves with the memory of the deck, and the carriage that is waiting will take her to Witham for the night, and to London tomorrow. Hamilton in the carriage will later record that the new queen was singing a German hymn, quietly, almost under her breath, the sort of singing a child does to comfort herself in the dark. She sang for most of the way to Witham. She fell asleep with her head on Hamilton's shoulder before the lamps were lit. The next morning they go to London. The garden gate at St. James's Palace is where the meeting happens. The carriage stops at the entrance to the Privy Garden, the gate that is used for private arrivals rather than ceremonial ones, and Charlotte steps down into a courtyard where a group of men is waiting. One of them is taller than the others. He is wearing court dress, his coat cut from dark silk, his face composed. She knows immediately which one he is. She has been preparing for this moment for 10 days at sea, and for several years before that. She steps forward, and she kneels, and she reaches for his hand to kiss it. George raises her up before her knee touches the ground. He says in French, the language they have agreed will be their common ground, that he is glad she has come. He kisses her on both cheeks. He takes her hand and he leads her through the gate and into the palace where she will live for the rest of her life, and where at 10 o'clock that evening, in the Chapel Royal, she will marry him. The wedding is at night. The Chapel Royal is lit by candles, and the women of the household have spent the day dressing the bride in a gown of stiff silver tissue and fitting her hair with a circlet of diamonds borrowed from the royal collection. Charlotte has been awake for 36 hours. She has been seasick for 10 days. She has met her husband 3 hours ago. She walks down the aisle of the chapel on the arm of the Duke of Cumberland, the king's uncle, and she repeats her vows in a voice so quiet that the bishop standing nearest to her can barely hear them. She is married before midnight. Her name is now Charlotte, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. Her old life ended at the garden gate. The coronation is 2 weeks later. The interval is filled with fittings, presentations, lessons in protocol, lessons in English, fittings, presentations, fittings. She is measured and remeasured. She is dressed and dressed again. She is taught how to enter a room, how to receive a curtsy, how to acknowledge a bow without smiling at the wrong person. The Duchess of Ancaster supervises every detail of her preparation. The Duchess of Hamilton stays close to her through the long days, translating where the chaplain's English fails. She holds her hand at moments where the strangeness becomes too much. She sits up with her in the evenings when she cannot sleep. The coronation itself takes place at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of September. The crown is too big. It has been made for the head of a king and is being placed on Queen Consort, and even with the cushioning that has been built into the inner band, it is too heavy and too wide, and it slips. Charlotte sits very still on the coronation chair, while the Duchess of Ancaster, in full court dress with her own coronet on her head, steps forward and adjusts the crown with both hands. She settles it into a position from which it will not fall. The moment is not noted by most of the witnesses. It is noted by a few. They do not forget the Duchess of Argyll, also a lady of the bedchamber, is the woman who hands her the orb. The procession back through the abbey, when it comes, is a procession of women. She has been Queen of Great Britain for 22 days. In her apartments at St. James's that night, after the coronation banquet and the reception and the long return through the streets where the bonfires were burning, Charlotte sits on the edge of her bed. One of her German women removes the silver tissue gown. The woman is named Juliane Schwellenberg. The other one, who is unbuckling Charlotte's shoes, is Johanna Hagedorn. Both of them have travelled with her from Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Both of them are the only two people in the palace who can speak to her without translation. Both of them, in the days since the arrival, have noticed that the English servants do not look at them when they pass. The English servants in turn have noticed that the Germans have already taken charge of the Queen's private dressing. They have begun giving instructions in a language no one else speaks. They have placed themselves between the Queen and the household in a position the household intends to dislodge. They will not dislodge it. Hagedorn will die before the resentment can grow into a struggle. Schwellenberg will live for 36 more years. By the time of her death, she will be the most feared and most resented figure in the Queen's household. Charlotte will have defended her against every attempt to remove her. The household will have learned that the Queen's loyalties once given are absolute. The court that will define the rest of Charlotte's life has just been assembled. The duchesses on the upper tier, the Germans on the inner tier, the maids and the dressers and the wardrobe women and the pages on the lower tiers, all of them in their places, all of them around a queen who is 17 years old, who has been in the country for 36 hours, who is now sitting in her shift in front of a coal fire in a room she has never seen before, a palace she does not yet know how to find her way around, a country whose language she cannot yet speak, while two German women whose names history will mostly forget unbutton her stays and let her finally breathe. She has never been so tired. The fire is warm. The bed is turned down. Schwellenberg blows out the lamp nearest the door, and the shadows close around her, and she lies down in the bed of the Queen of England, and she sleeps. The first weeks were the hardest. The English she had been trying to learn at sea was not the English she now had to learn at court. The phrases she had memorized were the phrases of a chaplain's primer, formal and clerical, and largely useless in the daily business of the household. The English of the bedchamber women, of the dressers and the wardrobe attendants, was a quicker, slangier, more practical language full of expressions that the primer had not seen fit to include. Charlotte listened to it with the close attention of a young woman who understood that her ability to function in the household depended on the speed of her acquisition. She made progress. She had a good ear. By the end of the first month, she could understand most of what was said to her. By the end of the third, she could reply, in a slow, careful, accented English that the duchesses praised in front of her and described privately, in their own letters, as charmingly imperfect. The accent never left her. The accent stayed, in fainter form, for the rest of her life. The accent was, in the long view, the smallest of the costs. She wrote home to her mother. She wrote in German by the steady candlelight of the small hours of the morning, in a hand that was steady and careful, and that did not, in any of the surviving letters, betray distress. She wrote about the rooms at St. James's. She wrote about the gardens at Buckingham House, the new residence the king had bought for her in the early months of the marriage, the place that would become her favourite of all the royal houses. She wrote about the weather, which she found grey. She did not write about the loneliness. The loneliness was the part of the experience for which she had no language, and she did not think it would do her any good to find one. The king was kind to her. This was the small saving fact of those first months. He had been told that the princess he had chosen was plain, and he had accepted the description. When she stepped down from the carriage at the garden gate, and he saw her for the first time, he saw a thin, slight, intelligent-looking girl with a wide mouth and a long nose, and he saw also, almost immediately, that she was frightened. He set himself to make her less frightened. He spoke to her in French. He led her by the hand. He stayed with her at the wedding supper longer than the protocol required, and told her, in a quiet aside, that he was glad she had come. In the days that followed, he visited her in her apartments. He sat with her. He brought her small presents that he had chosen himself, a book in French because he had been told she liked to read, a small enamel box, a piece of music for the harpsichord. He did not press her. He did not, in those first weeks, make any of the demands a husband might have made on a young wife in their position. He waited. He was 23. He had been told that the marriage was for the producing of heirs, and he understood that would have to wait until the wife was no longer afraid of him. He gave her time. The court watched him do it, and in the small, private way of a court that has been waiting to see how the new king will manage, was impressed. The pregnancies began within the year. The Prince of Wales was born in August of 1762, 10 months and a few days after the wedding, and from that moment until the autumn of 1783 the Queen would be either pregnant, recovering from a pregnancy, or about to begin one. There would be 15 children in 21 years. 13 would survive into adulthood, 2 would not. The body of a Queen of England in the late 18th century was, in the most precise sense, a productive instrument, and Charlotte's body was given to that production with a regularity that the household took for granted, and that the Queen herself, if she ever resented it, did not record. The lying-in chamber was a particular space. It was not the bedchamber where the Queen slept on ordinary nights. It was a separate room prepared for each confinement, hung with new tapestries to prevent draughts, fitted with a particular bed, equipped with a small adjacent room where the women who attended the birth could rest in shifts during the longer labours. The Queen entered the lying-in chamber some weeks before the expected birth and remained there until the official churching some weeks after. The whole process, from the announcement of the pregnancy to the public appearance of the Queen with her new child, occupied months of the court calendar and required the suspension of all the Queen's other duties. The drawing rooms were postponed. The visits to the country houses were cancelled. The household contracted around the central event of a body that was about to produce another heir. The women who attended the births were a particular set within the household. The midwife, who was a senior practitioner of her trade, came in from outside the household for the actual delivery. The royal physicians, who were men, attended in an adjacent chamber and entered only when summoned. The senior dressers were present throughout the labour. The lady of the bedchamber on duty was present at the births. The German ladies, Schwellenberg and her successors, were always present. The Queen was attended, in the most private hours of her life, by a female establishment that knew her body better than any other group of people in the country. The women held her hand. The women bathed her face with cool water. The women received the children as they came. The household kept the records. The wardrobe accounts of every confinement, the linens used, the bandages, the ointments, the small particular items that the period understood to be needed, are all preserved. The patience of the women who attended the Queen across 15 confinements is preserved with them. The Queen was a good patient. She was strong. She came through her labours in most cases without serious complication. She produced children whom the doctors pronounced healthy. She fed them at first herself, in the early weeks of the eldest children, before the household persuaded her that the demands of her position required the use of wet nurses. She handed each new child after the first weeks into the care of Lady Charlotte Finch, who was waiting in the schoolroom on the second floor with the educational toys she had been preparing for them. The pattern was set, the pattern repeated, the pattern produced by the autumn of 1783, the largest royal nursery in living English memory. Each child had a christening. Each christening was an event. The senior ladies of the household stood as proxies for the godparents, who could not, by virtue of being foreign sovereigns, attend in person. The carriages of the great families lined up in the courtyard at St. James's. The chapel royal was decorated. The names were chosen by the king and queen together, in a series of small private discussions in the apartments where the names of the previous children were being added to. Charlotte, after her own mother. Augusta, after the king's mother. Elizabeth, for the princess she had hoped to be like. The names accumulated, the household calendars filled with the birthdays of the royal children, 15 birthdays a year by the late 1770s, each one observed with a small private celebration in the apartments and a more public observance in the household at large. The years of Charlotte's 20s and early 30s were, in this sense, the years of a body in continuous service. The intellectual life she had brought from Strelitz, the love of music and of botanical illustration, and of the careful reading she had been raised to, persisted in the small intervals between the confinements. She continued to read. She continued to play the harpsichord. She continued to sit for portraits, including the great series by Alan Ramsay and later by Thomas Gainsborough that record her face across the years of the childbearing, the same intelligent eyes growing slightly tired around the corners, the same composed mouth, the same straight bearing. She did not change. She had been a young woman of careful self-possession at 17, and she became, across the years of her 20s, a queen of careful self-possession at 30. The body did the work. The mind held the rest of her together. The household revolved around both, and the women who attended her grew older with her, and the German ladies in particular grew, with each year, more entrenched in the inner positions that no amount of English resentment was ever going to dislodge them from. To understand what it meant to serve Queen Charlotte, you have to understand the ladder. The household was a structure with layers, and each layer had its own duties, its own privileges, its own salary, and its own degree of nearness to the Queen herself. A woman knew her place in this structure with a precision that no organizational chart in modern life can match. Every appointment was a negotiation. Every promotion was a victory. Every demotion was a public disgrace. At the top stood the mistress of the robes. She was always a duchess. She was the social pinnacle of the female household, the woman who outranked every other lady in the Queen's service. She received the largest salary, somewhere in the region of £900 a year in the early reign, and she was never expected to do the actual work of dressing the Queen. Her role was ceremonial. She presided. She accompanied Charlotte to the great events of the court. She stood beside her at the drawing rooms, and she was, in the eyes of the public, the Queen's most visible female companion. The Duchess of Ancaster held the post for the first 18 years of the reign. She was succeeded by other duchesses in their turn, the office passing among the great families in a rotation that was watched by the political world with a careful and informed attention. Below the mistress of the robes came the ladies of the bedchamber. There were 6 of them. They were countesses and sometimes the wives of barons, never lower in rank, and they served on a system of rotation that allowed each woman to be in attendance for roughly 2 months at a stretch before returning to her own household. Their salary was £500 a year. Their duties were to attend the Queen at formal occasions, to accompany her on visits, to receive callers on her behalf when she was indisposed, to hand her a fan or a glass of water when she required one. They were companions rather than servants. They were chosen for their family connections as much as for their personal qualities. Some of them, like Lady Harcourt, became genuine friends to Charlotte. Others, less suited to the work, served their 2 months and counted the days. Below the ladies of the bedchamber came the women of the bedchamber. There were 8 of them. They were gentlewomen rather than peeresses. They came from the families of the gentry, from the daughters of clergymen and lawyers and untitled landowners, and their salary was modest, around £200 a year. Their work was real. They were the tier on which the day-to-day running of the Queen's private rooms depended. They carried the messages, they ordered the wardrobe, they corresponded with tradesmen, they organised the small purchases and arrangements that the bedchamber ladies were too grand to handle. A woman in this tier was busy, and then, set apart from the English ladder altogether, were the keepers of the robes. This was Charlotte's innovation, and it was deeply resented. The post did not exist in the household of her predecessor. Charlotte created it for the 2 German women she had brought with her, and she defended it for the rest of her reign against everyone who tried to abolish it. The keeper of the robes had access to the Queen's private dressing. She had access to the Queen's private correspondence, the seals broken on the Queen's personal letters before they reached her hand. She had access to the Queen's small economies, the household accounts, the private gifts. She had access, in short, to the Queen herself, in a way that the great English duchesses with their grand ceremonial titles did not. The mistress of the robes saw the Queen at the drawing-room. The keeper of the robes saw the Queen in her shift. The English household understood the difference. The English household never forgave it. There were 2 keepers of the robes by the 1780s. The first keeper was Juliane Schwellenberg, the woman who had stepped off the yacht at Harwich. She had risen through the ranks across 2 decades, and she had risen because Charlotte placed her there and would not let her be moved. The second keeper, after a series of earlier holders, was Frances Burney. We will meet her properly in time. Below the keepers came the maids of honour. There were 6 of them. They were unmarried. They were young, usually between 18 and 25, and they were, in effect, the marriage market in residence. They lived at the palace. They ate at the palace. They were presented at every drawing-room and seen by every eligible courtier and visiting nobleman, and the salary of £200 a year was less the point than the access. A girl who came to court as a maid of honour came to find a husband, and most of them found one within a few seasons, and the post turned over with a regularity that the household took for granted. Their duties were light. They walked behind the Queen in processions. They handed her her gloves. They were ornamental. They were strategic. They were watched. Below the maids of honour came the women whose work was less visible and more constant. The sub-governesses who ran the schoolroom under the senior governess of the royal nursery, and whom we will meet in detail. The wardrobe women who actually fetched the gowns from the presses, who steamed the silks, who polished the buckles, who dressed the Queen's hair under the supervision of whichever German lady was on duty. The necessary women whose existence the household preferred not to think about, and whose duty was to empty the chamber pots and change the linen, and remove the slops in the early hours of the morning before anyone else was awake. The pages, young men of good family who carried letters and stood in corridors and waited for the small commissions that filled their day. Each of these tiers had its own salary scale, its own quarters within the palace, its own table at meals, and its own cluster of privileges that were as strictly enforced as the social distinctions outside the palace walls. A wardrobe woman did not eat at the same table as a woman of the bedchamber. A maid of honour did not enter the same drawing-room as a necessary woman. The hierarchy was visible in the corridors. It was visible in the seating at chapel. It was visible in the dress that each woman was required to wear when she was in the Queen's presence. The elaborate court mantua and hooped petticoat for the ladies, the simpler black silk for the working tier, the plain cap and apron for the women who came in before dawn to make the household possible. The wardrobe women in particular did the work that almost no one outside the household ever saw. They were the women who managed the Queen's clothes. The Queen's clothes were a small museum. There were court mantuas of state silk, embroidered with silver and gold thread in patterns that took the embroidery houses of Lyon and Spitalfields months to complete. There were morning gowns of muslin and cotton for the private rooms. There were riding habits of dark wool tailored by the same firms that tailored the king. There were the elaborate dresses for the drawing rooms with their hoops and their lappets and their trains. There were court slippers of silk, embroidered to match the gowns, that were not designed to be worn for more than a single occasion. There were stays layered and laced and weighted with whalebone that required the assistance of two women to lace properly. There were stockings of fine silk and of finer silk and of finest silk, ranged in their drawers in the wardrobe room according to the occasion they were to be used for. The wardrobe was a working library of textiles, and the women who maintained it were the librarians. They knew by long practice which gown went with which underpinning. They knew how to fold the silks so that the creases would fall out before the queen was due to wear them. They knew how to lift a stain from a cuff without damaging the embroidery. They knew the small repairs that the ordinary wear of a queen's clothing required, and they knew which damage was beyond repair and would require the gown to be set aside for unpicking and reuse. They knew when the queen returned from a wet day in the carriage with the hem of her gown muddied, exactly what to do to have the gown ready again for her next appearance. The senior wardrobe women had been doing this work since they were girls. They had come into service in their teens. They had risen through the lower ranks of the household by the slow accumulation of competence and trust, and by the time they reached the senior posts, they were women in their 40s and 50s whose understanding of fabric was deeper than any duchess in the household possessed. The maids of honour rotated through the post in shorter spans. A young woman appointed at 20 rarely stayed past 25. The post was, in the simplest terms, a marriage market with a salary. Mary Hamilton herself had been preceded into the household by a string of young women whose names the contemporary newspapers tracked with close interest. Caroline Vernon, the daughter of Lord Vernon, had been a maid of honour in the early 1760s and had married a baronet within 2 seasons. Charlotte Dive, the niece of a bishop, had served for 3 years and had married a member of Parliament. The progression was conventional. The young women came to court with the expectation that within 5 years they would be the wives of someone in the political class, and the household, in its quieter calculations, agreed. The ones who did not marry were a separate category. There were always a few. The maid of honour who turned 30 and was still in the post had, in some sense, missed the window the post had been designed to provide. She might continue in service for another decade. She might transfer to one of the working tiers below the bedchamber if she had the temperament for it. She might retire to her family's house in the country and live the remainder of her life on a modest annuity that the household provided to long-serving maids who had not made the transition the household had expected of them. The household tracked these careers with its quiet patience. The records of the maids of honour, kept across the decades by the master of the household, are a list of names that scrolls past in the long parade of young women who came and went, and were, in most cases, replaced before anyone outside their immediate families remembered they had been there. The dresses were the working core of the Queen's most intimate ritual. There were 4 of them at any time, in addition to the German keepers, and they served on a daily rotation that placed 2 of them in the Queen's apartments at any moment of her active hours. Their duty was the dressing itself, the lacing of the stays, the pinning of the petticoats, the arrangement of the gown over the underpinnings, the fitting of the lappets, the placing of the cap, the pinning of the hair, which in the early reign was done in the Queen's own hair, and in the later reign over a small cushion that gave the hair its required height. The dressing was a long performance. It was performed twice a day on ordinary days, 3 times a day on days with a major event in the evening, sometimes 4 times a day in the busiest weeks of the court calendar. The dressers held the pins in their mouths while their hands worked. They moved without speech. They worked when the Queen was in a thoughtful mood, in a silence that the entire room observed. They worked when the Queen was talking, with the quiet attention of women who had been trained to listen without appearing to listen. They were the household specialists. The names of these women survive in the household accounts. Mrs. Egerton, Mrs. Thielke, who came over from Mecklenburg with the Queen as a young dresser and stayed for 42 years. Mrs. Beckerdorf, another German dresser of long service. Mrs. Hutchinson, the senior English dresser of the middle reign. They are listed in the wardrobe accounts with their salaries, their perquisites, the small gifts the Queen had ordered for them at Christmas and on their birthdays. They are listed in the death notices when their long service ended. They are not in any account that the public ever read. The figures who appear in the histories, they are the figures the histories were impossible without. The necessary women came in before dawn. They lit the fires. They emptied the chamber pots. They carried away the slops in covered buckets through the back stairs that ran behind the Queen's apartments and led down to the courtyards where the household refuse was managed. They changed the linen. They scoured the surfaces. They were gone before the Queen woke. The household preferred not to acknowledge their existence. They were paid less than the wardrobe women and were given quarters in the lower floors of the palace, in rooms shared with the kitchen staff and the laundry women, and they were the lowest paid and least regarded of the women whose work the household required. They were also, in the strict sense, the women without whom the upper rooms of the palace could not have functioned at all. A queen who did not have her chamber pot emptied was a queen who would not be queen for very long. The pay for the lowest tiers was modest. A necessary woman received in the 1780s perhaps £15 a year. A wardrobe woman received perhaps 30. A senior dresser received 70. The figures rose by the small accumulated raises that long service produced, and the perquisites added to the cash, but the lowest tiers were paid, in real terms, what the household considered the going rate for women's domestic labour, which was less than what was paid to the men in equivalent positions, and which was, even by the standards of the period, modest. The compensation was the lodging. The compensation was the meals. A lady of the bedchamber received lodgings at the palace, free meals, the right to wear court dress at every public event, the right to call herself a member of the royal household for the rest of her life. A maid of honour received a furnished apartment, a horse from the royal stables when she rode out, the right to be seen, considered. A wardrobe woman received the cast-off gowns of the Queen, which were sometimes worth more than a year of her own wages, and which she was permitted to sell or to alter for her own use as her circumstances required. A page received an apprenticeship in the manners of court life that would, in his subsequent career, open every door he ever needed to enter. The whole household ran on a system of compensation that was as much about access and reputation as it was about money. The cash was modest, the associations were not. The politics was the part the public did not see. Every appointment was contested. The senior posts were political prizes, distributed by the Prime Minister of the day in consultation with the King and the Queen, and the manoeuvring for them was as fierce as the manoeuvring for cabinet places. A duke whose wife was made mistress of the robes had won a victory over rival families. A baronet whose daughter was made a maid of honour had inserted his line into the highest social register in the country. The Queen's preferences were known, and they were considered, but they did not always prevail. Charlotte learned across her first decade to choose her battles. She did not always win them. She did sometimes lose a lady of the bedchamber she had wanted. She never lost Schwellenberg, and the household understood by the end of the 1770s that there were certain figures around the Queen whom no political pressure could remove. The household lived inside its own rules. A footman who entered the Queen's apartments without permission was dismissed. A wardrobe woman who took home a piece of the Queen's lace that had been discarded was dismissed. A maid of honour who corresponded with a man without the Queen's knowledge was warned, and on a second offence was dismissed. The discipline of the household was not laid out in a published code. It was understood. It was passed down by senior women to junior women, by the long observation of how the older members of the household conducted themselves, by the small private warnings that a woman received from her superior when she was approaching a line. The discipline was effective because the alternatives were severe. To be dismissed from the Queen's household was the centre of female social life in England, and a young woman who had been dismissed could not, in most cases, find an equivalent place anywhere else. It was the most prestigious work a woman could hold in Britain. The post of Mistress of the Robes was the highest position any woman not born royal could attain. The Queen's household was the apex of female public life. Every appointment was reported in the newspapers. Every quarrel was tracked by the political diarists. Every retirement was an event. It was also one of the most miserable. The hours were long. The standing was brutal. The boredom in the lower tiers was punishing. The competition for the Queen's notice was constant, and the consequences of falling out of favour were severe. And the women who held these posts were, almost without exception, women who had no realistic alternative. They were paid in proximity, and they paid for it with their feet, their backs, their eyes, their patience, and a great many of the years that, in an ordinary life, they would have spent at home. In the spring of 1762, while the Queen lay in her confinement after the birth of the Prince of Wales, an offer was made to a 36-year-old gentlewoman named Lady Charlotte Finch. The offer was the post of governess to the royal children. There was, at this point, only one royal child. The post would, by the time of her retirement, have grown to include 15. Lady Charlotte Finch was the daughter of the Earl of Pomfret. She had been educated, unusually for her sex and her century, in mathematics, in classical languages, in modern history, and in the natural sciences. She was, by every contemporary account, the most learned woman of her rank in England. She was married to the Honourable William Finch, the younger son of the Earl of Aylesford, a man whose conversation no one ever recorded as memorable, and whose wife's intelligence was the principal thing anyone said about him. She had 4 children of her own. She accepted the post. The education that had shaped her was unusual enough to be worth pausing on. Her mother, Henrietta Louisa Fermor, the Countess of Pomfret, had been a learned woman in her own right, a friend of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and of the small circle of titled women in the 1720s and 1730s who had taken seriously the question of whether young women of their class ought to be given the kind of education routinely provided to their broth. The Countess had decided that her own daughters would be. She had chosen tutors herself. She had supervised the curriculum. She had made Lady Charlotte and her sisters read in the same authors their brothers were reading at school, in the same translations, with the same expectation of comprehension. The mother had then, when the daughter was a young woman, taken her on a long European tour that lasted several years, and that included a residence in Florence, where Lady Charlotte had perfected her Italian and had been allowed access, by her mother's friends, to the libraries of Florentine intellectuals to whom no English girl of her age had ever previously been introduced. By the time Lady Charlotte returned to England in her mid-20s, she was, by every measure that could be applied, one of the best educated young women in Europe. She had married William Finch shortly afterwards, a marriage of position rather than passion, and she had lived the conventional life of a peeress's daughter and a peer's daughter-in-law for 2 decades before the offer to take charge of the royal nursery arrived. She accepted because her own 4 children were now mostly grown, because the post was the highest of its kind a woman could hold, and because she understood, with the practiced realism of a woman of her age and her education, the work she had been preparing for since she was a girl had at last been made available to her. She had spent her life in a society that did not, in any formal way, employ educated women. The royal nursery was, in the strict sense, the first institutional position of its kind that England had created for a woman of her qualifications. She would create the model. The model would shape the next century of English royal childhood. She would hold it for 30 years. The schoolroom at Buckingham House was on the 2nd floor, a long room with windows facing east. the morning light coming in across the rooftops of the city beyond. There were tables for writing, a stand for the globe, a press for the books, a fire that was kept burning from October to April, and a turkey carpet on the floor that was rolled up in summer and replaced with a cooler matting. The walls were painted a pale green. There were prints of the kings and queens of England on one wall. There were maps of the world on the opposite wall. There was, on a low shelf within reach of small hands, a collection of educational toys that Lady Charlotte Finch had commissioned herself, and that the children were allowed to take down and play with under supervision when their lessons were done. The most famous of these toys, though almost no one in 1762 knew that they were going to become famous, were the jigsaw maps. The idea was hers. It was an idea so simple in retrospect that it is difficult to believe no one had had it before. A map of Europe, mounted on a thin sheet of mahogany, sawed into pieces along the borders of the countries. A child who could not yet read could fit France into the space where France belonged, could fit Spain belonged, could learn the shape of the continent through the work of the hands rather than eyes. She had the maps made by a young engraver in London named John Spilsbury, who would later be credited as the inventor of the puzzle. The patron was Lady Charlotte Finch. The pedagogy was hers. The market she had created would, within a generation, fill the schoolrooms of Europe, and would, 2 centuries later, still be a children's toy. The royal children learned geography from her jigsaws. They learned arithmetic from counters, and from a small abacus that she had ordered specially. They learned to write on slates, and to read from primers that she had selected herself. She sometimes annotated those primers in her own hand to soften a phrase she found too harsh, or to add an explanation that the original printer had not thought to include. She taught the older children French. She taught the younger ones their letters. She supervised the work of the sub-governesses who took over each tier of the nursery as the children moved up through it. There were 3 sub-governesses by the late 1770s, and they were the working hands of the schoolroom under Lady Charlotte Finch's direction. Miss Frederica Planter, the eldest of the 3, was Swiss by birth, and had been brought into the household for her command of French and German. She was reserved, precise, and not particularly warm, and the children who passed through her care remembered her clearly without remembering her with much affection. Miss Martha Goldsworthy was a different woman. The princesses called her Gully. The name was a diminutive that one of the small girls had invented and that the others had taken up, and it stuck, and it followed her through the whole of her 30 years in the household. Gully was warm. Gully was funny. Gully held the babies and sang to them and read to them in a soft Devonshire voice that the older princesses, in their letters from later life, would refer to as the sound of the schoolroom itself. The royal nursery would not have been what it was without her. The older princesses, in their letters home from their married lives in Germany or from their lodgings at Windsor, would still ask after Gully 30 years after they had stopped seeing her every day. The 3rd sub-governess, when she arrived, was the youngest of them. Her name was Mary Hamilton. She came into the household in the autumn of 1777. She was 21. She was the great-niece of the Duke of Hamilton, a connection that had not hurt her candidacy, and that she carried lightly. She had been educated at home. She had read more widely than was usual for a young woman of her time, and she had a face that the prints of the period were too cautious to flatter, and that everyone who met her in life found striking. She was tall. She was self-contained. She had a way of listening that suggested she was assembling more information than the person speaking to her realized. She was put in charge of the younger princesses, the small girls who were too old for the nurse and too young for the schoolroom. She was popular with them within a week. She was also, within a year, the favourite of every adult who passed through that wing of the palace. Lady Charlotte Finch noticed her immediately. The senior governess wrote in a private letter that Miss Hamilton was the best appointment the household had made in a decade. The young woman had a gift for the children that could not be taught. Her instinct for what each child needed at each moment was more reliable than the instincts of women 3 times her age. The praise was high, it was earned. The princesses adored her. The Queen, when she came to the nursery to see her children, lingered to talk to Mary Hamilton in a way she did not linger with the other sub-governesses. The King nodded to her in the corridors. The household, without quite saying so, began to treat her as someone who would rise. The schoolroom ran on a daily rhythm that Lady Charlotte Finch had established in the first years, and that she did not allow to vary. The children rose at 6. They washed and dressed and ate breakfast in the nursery dining room. They were in the schoolroom by 9. They worked at their tables until noon. They had dinner at 1. They had a walk in the afternoon, weather permitting, in the gardens of Buckingham House, or, when the family moved there, the great park at Kew. They had more lessons until 5. They had supper at 7. They were in bed by 9. The rhythm was unvarying, and the children loved it for that reason. The world outside their nursery was a world of state ceremony and political crisis and fluctuating drama. The schoolroom was the one place where Tuesday looked exactly like Wednesday, looked exactly like Thursday, and the certainty was its own form of love. Discipline was firm and almost never harsh. Lady Charlotte Finch did not believe in beating children. She believed in the withdrawal of approval, in the look that registered disappointment without anger, in the brief and devastating sentence that ended with the child wishing it had not done whatever it had done. The children obeyed her because they wanted to please her, and her because she had made them feel, from their earliest memories, that her attention was the most valuable thing in the room. The nursery dispersed slowly. The Prince of Wales left it first, moved into his own apartments at the age of 12, given a household of his own, allowed to begin the long apprenticeship for the throne that would shape him into the figure the country was learning to dread. Frederick followed him, then William, then Edward. The boys went into their own establishments and the girls remained, and the nursery contracted around the daughters as the years passed. By the autumn of 1779, the Prince of Wales was 17. He had been out of Lady Charlotte Finch's care for 5 years. He had begun to spend his evenings at the theatre, and his nights at the houses of friends. His parents would have preferred he did not have. He had not yet committed any of the public scandals that would, in the coming decade, define him in the popular press, but the trajectory was visible to anyone in the household who was watching, and Lady Charlotte Finch was watching. She had raised him. She knew what he was becoming. She could not, by virtue of her position, do very much to prevent it. But the Prince of Wales still came to the nursery. He came to see his sisters. He saw Mary Hamilton. He was 17. He was, even in his unsteady early manhood, a charming boy when he wished to be, and he wished suddenly to be charming to her. He began to arrive at the schoolroom on excuses that fooled nobody. He began to write her letters. He began to send her presents. She did what no one in her position had been trained to do. She refused. She refused without offending him. She refused repeatedly and quietly, and with a skill that the household, watching from the side, did not at first understand. It would by the end be remembered as the most extraordinary act of management ever performed by a sub-governess in the history of the English court. We are about to find out how she did it. The first letter arrived in February of 1779. It was carried by a page from the prince's apartments to the schoolroom on the 2nd floor. It was addressed to Miss Hamilton in a hand she did not yet recognise, and it was sealed with the personal seal of the Prince of Wales. The page waited for an answer. Mary Hamilton opened the letter and read it. She wrote a brief, polite reply that committed her to nothing. The page took it away. She filed the letter in a small cabinet she kept in her room. The cabinet would, over the next 18 months, fill with hundreds more. The Prince of Wales was 16 in February of 1779. He would turn 17 in the August of that year. He was already, by the standards of the household, difficult. He drank in the evenings. He gambled with his friends. He went to the theatre and stayed late, and came back to the palace by routes that the porters were instructed not to ask about. He had recently begun to call himself a man of feeling, a phrase that had been popularized by the novels of the period. He seems to have understood it as a license to feel everything to the maximum, and to insist that everyone around him acknowledge the feeling. He fell in love with women he had seen only across a room. He wrote them poetry. He sent them gifts. He had, in the 18 months before he met Mary Hamilton, fixed his attention on at least 3 young women of the household, none of whom had been able to handle him, all of whom had ended up either humiliated or dismissed. He sent the first letter at the start of February. The first letter was, by the standards of what would follow, mild. He addressed her as his sister. He wrote that he had observed her from a distance and admired her qualities. He hoped that she would consent to a friendly correspondence. He signed himself her affectionate brother. She replied that she would be honoured to correspond with His Royal Highness on the terms he had named. As his sister, only as his sister. The terms were stated in the first reply, and they were never relaxed. The correspondence that followed ran to several hundred letters across 2 years. It was carried on under those terms. The prince, who in every other relationship in his life pushed past every limit he was given, did not, with Mary Hamilton, ever quite succeed in moving past the line she had drawn. He tried. The escalation began within weeks. The letters grew longer. They grew daily. They began to arrive in the morning and the evening, sometimes both. He wrote of his admiration for her mind. He wrote that the sight of her in the corridor had become the central event of his day. He sent her a lock of his hair tied with a ribbon. He sent her verses he had composed himself, verses that even his admirers would have admitted were not very good. He addressed her, in a phase that lasted some months, as Miranda after the heroine of The Tempest, and he signed himself Palamon after a hero of his own choosing. He proposed clandestine meetings. He proposed that they should write to each other in code. He threatened, more than once, that if she would not love him as he loved her, he would not be able to bear his life. She handled it. She handled it the way an experienced negotiator handles a counterparty who has lost his composure, which is to say, she did not lose hers. She wrote back warmly. She did not encourage him. She did not crush him. She acknowledged his feelings without reciprocating them. She gently corrected him when he overstepped. She refused again and again to meet him alone. She refused to write to him in code. She refused the locks of hair, returning them by the next page with a note explaining that a young woman in her position could not accept such gifts. She refused, when he proposed it, the idea of a secret engagement. She did all of this without ever telling him that what he was doing was wrong, because she understood, as the women who had failed before her had not, that telling a Prince of Wales he was wrong was the surest way to drive him into open scandal. She wrote him long, gentle letters about his future. She praised the qualities he had not yet developed. She suggested, in language so tactful that he sometimes did not realize he was being suggested to, that he might find more appropriate companions among the young women of the household. She named other young women he might admire. She praised them to him. She redirected his attention, by careful inches, away from herself. The household was watching. Lady Charlotte Finch was watching. Schwellenberg, in the Queen's apartments below, was watching with the close attention of a woman who missed nothing. The Queen herself was watching, though the Queen, in this matter as in many others, did not intervene. Charlotte trusted Mary Hamilton. Charlotte had assessed the young woman in the schoolroom and had concluded accurately that Hamilton was the only person in the household who could manage the prince without making the situation worse. The Queen withdrew. The Queen waited. The Queen was rewarded. In December of 1779, the Prince of Wales attended a performance of The Winter's Tale at the Drury Lane Theatre. The actress playing the role of Perdita was a young woman named Mary Robinson. She was 21. She was very beautiful. She had a stage presence that the prince, in his theatrical phase, was exactly the audience for. He saw her perform, and he wrote to her the next morning. The courtship that began that night would, by the spring of 1780, have produced an arrangement, a settled income for the actress, a public mistress for the prince, the first of the great public scandals of his early manhood. It was not the worst possible outcome. The worst possible outcome would have been a private scandal involving a sub-governess in the Queen's own household, a young woman of good family and impeccable reputation, a woman whose dismissal would have damaged the Queen and whose ruined country. The Prince of Wales had a public mistress. He did not have a private disaster. The letters began to slow in the early months of 1780. They did not stop. He continued to write to her. The terms of their correspondence remained what Hamilton had set in February of 1779. Sister, brother, nothing more. The terms held until Hamilton's departure from the household in 1782. She left the Queen's service quietly. She gave her notice in the proper form. She was thanked for her years of work. She was given the customary gift of a piece of plate engraved with the Queen's monogram. She left the palace with her reputation intact. She did not leave with anything that could be used against her. The household closed around the gap she had left, and the appointment was filled and the schoolroom moved on. 3 years later, in 1785, Mary Hamilton married a gentleman named John Dickinson. He was a Cheshire man of independent fortune, intelligent, devoted to her. The marriage was happy. They had one daughter. They lived for the rest of their lives at his estate at Taxal. Mary kept up a wide correspondence with the literary and intellectual women of her generation. She lived with the steady contentment of a woman who had survived a passage that could have destroyed her, and who had emerged from it with herself entirely her own. She kept the letters, every one of them. The hundreds of letters from a Prince of Wales who would later be a regent and later a king, the letters of a teenage boy in love with the wrong woman, the letters of an obsession that she had managed without breaking it and without breaking him. She kept them in the cabinet she had carried from the palace. She kept them through her marriage and her widowhood and her old age. She did not show them. She did not destroy them. She kept them as evidence, perhaps, that she had been who she said she was, and that the prince, in his early youth, had been capable of feeling something more genuine than the public version of him would later suggest. The letters survived. They are now in a public archive. Anyone who wishes to read the full correspondence between the future George IV and the woman who refused him, in his own hand and in hers, can do so. The story they tell is the story of a young woman who at 23 did with a teenage prince what the rest of his life suggested no one else was ever quite able to do. She held the line. She kept his trust. She redirected him without humiliating him. She walked away when she had finished, and she lived a long and quiet life. And the only reason the world knows her name now is because she had the foresight 2 centuries ago to keep what would otherwise have been thrown into the fire. She is the woman the household called Miss Hamilton. She is the woman the prince called Miranda. She is the woman who, in the autumn of 1779, looked across the schoolroom at a 16-year-old boy who had come to write his first letter to her, and who decided, before he had finished speaking, exactly how she was going to handle him. She handled him, and the Queen, watching from the apartments below, never had to intervene. The Queen's own life, in the rooms below the schoolroom, ran along its own private currents that the household sometimes noticed and sometimes did not. The Queen read. She read more than any English queen before her had read, and probably more than any English queen since. Her library, by the end of her life, contained over 4,000 volumes. It included, in addition to the standard works of theology and history that any royal library possessed, a serious collection of botanical works, of musical scores, of works in German and French and Italian, of the modern English novelists whom she did not always approve of, but could not stop reading. She had read Richardson. She had read Fielding, with reservations. She read Burney before she knew the author would one day stand in her dressing chamber. She read the new novels that her ladies brought her. She read the older works that the librarians of the Royal Library brought up from the storage rooms when she requested them. She kept lists in her own hand of the books she had finished and still wished to read. The lists survive. They are the lists of a serious reader who did not consider reading a frivolous occupation. She played the harpsichord. She had been taught as a girl in Strelitz by a court musician of moderate gift, and she had brought the practice with her to England, and she had continued it in the small private hours of her week for the rest of her life. She had her own instruments, several of them, in her private apartments at the various royal residences. She had had Handel's music when Handel had been the great living composer, and she had been one of the first patrons of the young Mozart, who had visited London with his father and his sister in 1764 and 1765, when she had been a young queen still finding her footing. The young Mozart had played for her. He had been 8. She had given his father a generous gift and had taken away from the visit a memory that she still spoke of in the household decades later. She continued, throughout her life, to support the work of musicians she admired. Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of the great Bach, was her music master for many years and a regular figure in the small concerts she held in her drawing room. The chamber music of those decades, the works the Queen herself listened to, were the staple of her evenings when no court occasion required her elsewhere. She kept a botanic garden at Kew. The botanic garden, which had been begun by the King's mother in the 1750s, became under Charlotte's direction one of the most important plant collections in Europe. Joseph Banks, the great explorer botanist who had sailed with Cook and who had been bringing back exotic specimens from the southern oceans for years, was the director. The Queen visited the gardens regularly. She had her favourite plants. She had named with Mrs. Delaney the small varieties they had been studying together. Frogmore was hers. The King had given it to her in the 1790s as a small house and garden of her own, and she had developed it, with the patience of a woman who knew what she liked, into the kind of small private retreat that no other royal residence had ever provided her. The princesses came to Frogmore. Mrs. Delaney came when she was still alive. The Queen could be alone there in the way that the great houses did not permit. She gardened there, in the small, careful way that an arthritic woman of 70 can garden, with the assistance of a young gardener whose duty was to do the actual digging while the Queen indicated where she wished the plants to go. The garden was the central pleasure of her late years. The garden was perhaps the only thing in her long life that she had built entirely for herself. There is in any household that exists for a long time a figure who becomes the silence at the centre of every conversation, the figure whom no one openly criticizes and no one privately defends, the figure whose name is dropped from a sentence the moment a senior person walks into the room. In the Queen's household in the 1780s, that figure was Juliane Elizabeth Schwellenberg. She had been with Charlotte for over 20 years. She would be with her for 16 more. She had risen, by slow degrees, and with a determination that nobody around her had been able to break, from the position of personal companion to the position of first keeper of the robes. The post that Charlotte had created for her now placed her at the gate of the Queen's private apartments. A letter to the Queen passed through her hands. A request for an audience passed through her mouth. A petition for a position in the household passed through her judgment before it reached the Queen at all. She was, in effect, the keeper of the Queen, and the household understood this and worked around it as the household had been working around it for a generation. She was 60 in the year that Frances Burney joined the household. She would be over 70 by the time Burney left. Her health was poor and growing worse. She suffered from rheumatism, from a chronic inflammation of the chest, from the slow and grinding pain of a body that had been working hard for 40 years and that resented the work. The pain made her difficult, the difficulty made her cruel. The cruelty was directed with a precision that suggested long practice at whichever subordinate was most accessible at the moment. Her German never left her. She had lived in England for 30 years, and she still spoke a broken English of her own invention, an English in which the verbs were sometimes German and the syntax was always German. The consonants had a hard guttural shape that her mouth did not soften with practice. Burney recorded the speech in her diary. The diary makes Schwellenberg a figure of comedy. The reality in the corridors of the palace was not comic. Her broken English was the language of dismissal, of refusal, of orders given without warmth and without the possibility of negotiation. To be addressed by Schwellenberg in her own English was to be informed that you had been weighed in her mind and found wanting. She presided over the household table. To be invited to eat at her table was an obligation, not a privilege. The second keeper of the robes was required to sit there at every meal. The senior gentlewomen attended on rotation. Visiting ladies and minor courtiers were sometimes commanded to her table by way of inflicting a punishment that she alone considered an honour. The food was good. The company was unbearable. Schwellenberg led the conversation. She chose the topics. She decided when a subject had been sufficiently discussed, and when it was time to move on. She had favourites. She had enemies. She was always, at any given meal, in the process of either elevating a favourite or destroying an enemy, and the destruction was carried out in front of the others with a deliberate slowness that the others were required to witness in silence. She kept frogs. This sounds like a detail invented by a novelist, but it is not. Schwellenberg kept frogs in glass cases in her private apartments at Buckingham House and at Windsor. She had them caught in the gardens by servants who must have been bemused by the request. She fed them flies and small insects with a pair of tweezers. She made visitors admire them. She named them. She believed, against the medical opinion of every doctor in London, that the croaking of frogs was beneficial to her health, and she insisted on having the cases moved into her bedroom at night so that she could fall asleep to the sound of them. Visitors who disliked frogs, which is to say almost everybody, were required to express enthusiasm for the collection or to suffer the consequences of having failed to do so. The frogs were the household's standing test for whether you could be relied upon to flatter the first keeper of the robes. Most people could. Most people did. Frances Burney, who detested the frogs and who detested the woman who kept them, perfected a small repertoire of polite remarks that sounded like enthusiasm and that committed her to nothing. The carriage was the worst. When the household moved between palaces, which it did frequently, the senior women travelled in a coach assigned to them by the master of the household. The first keeper of the robes had her own coach. The second keeper, who was Burney throughout the relevant years, was required to travel with her. The journeys were long, sometimes a full day on the road between Windsor and London, or between Windsor and Kew. The company was unbreakable. The worst feature of the journeys, the feature that Burney recorded with a controlled fury that she did not allow herself to express in any other context, was the matter of the windows. Schwellenberg insisted on keeping the windows of the carriage open in all weather. In summer, this was bearable. In winter, it was a slow torture. The wind came through the open frames and across the seat and into the eyes of the passenger sitting opposite, who could not, by virtue of the older woman's seniority, ask for the windows to be closed. Burney developed, over the course of her first winter at court, an inflammation of the eyes that became chronic. It recurred for the rest of her time in the household. She traced it directly to the carriage windows that Schwellenberg would not allow to be shut. Her diary records the experience with a calm that is almost more frightening than complaint would have been. She knew that she was being damaged. She knew that she could not stop it. She wrote the experience down because writing it down was the only available form of resistance. There was a hierarchy to Schwellenberg's contempt. She fawned on the great aristocrats. The duchesses who came to court were greeted with a deference that bordered on the obsequious. The German accent suddenly softened, the cruelty suddenly tucked away. The wives of dukes received compliments. The wives of earls received attention. The wives of men below the rank of viscount received tolerance. The daughters of the gentry, the women who made up the working tier of the household, received the full weight of her contempt. Burney, who came from a respectable but untitled family, was at the lowest point of the spectrum that Schwellenberg recognized. She was an upper servant in the eyes of the first keeper of the robes. She was to be reminded of this fact at every opportunity. The reminders were petty, accumulative, daily. They wore Burney down across 5 years. She was not loved by the other Germans either. Madame Hagedorn, the original companion who had travelled from Mecklenburg-Strelitz, had died decades before, and her successors at the inner court had not formed an alliance with Schwellenberg. The other German attendants kept their distance. She was, by the late 1780s, alone at the centre of a household that worked around her and waited for her death. The death of Hagedorn in 1764 had been the small unspoken hinge on which Schwellenberg's later character had turned. The two women had been companions since their girlhood at Strelitz. They had crossed the sea together. They had stood beside the Queen at her wedding and at her coronation, and at the small private moments of her first English years. They had been the only people in England the Queen could speak to without translation, and the Queen, in those first years, had relied on both of them with an emotional gratitude that the ordinary household could not match. Hagedorn had been the warmer of the two. She had been gentler, slower to take offence, less quick to identify a slight. She had been, by the small accounts that survive of her, the sister Schwellenberg had not had. Her death of a fever that the doctors did not name had taken a few weeks, and Schwellenberg had nursed her through it. And the Queen had visited her sickbed daily, and at the end of it Schwellenberg had been left in the inner positions of the household, alone. She had been 37. She had spent the next 33 years, by all the evidence the household preserved, in a slow private hardening that nobody who had known her in her younger years would have predicted. Whether the death of Hagedorn was the cause, or whether the death had only revealed the woman who had always been there underneath, was the kind of question the household discussed in its lower rooms and never resolved. The Queen, who had loved Hagedorn, and who had loved Schwellenberg, and who had felt the loss of one of them in ways she could not entirely articulate, had drawn closer to the survivor in the years afterwards. The closer she had drawn, the more difficult Schwellenberg had become for everyone else around her. The death did not come for a long time. She fell ill in the early 1790s and recovered. She fell ill again in the middle of the decade and recovered. She lasted, as the malicious lasted in any household, by sheer tenacity and by the Queen's continued protection, and the household, watching her decline year after year, began to fear that she would, in the end, simply outlast all of them. She died at last in the spring of 1797. She was a few weeks past her 70th birthday. The Queen was at her bedside. The reaction in the household was, on the surface, decorous. Mourning was put on. The proper letters of condolence were written. The proper services were attended. The household table that night and for several nights afterwards was conducted in a hush that even the most senior members did not break. But the relief, in the corridors and the lower rooms, was difficult to contain. A weight had been lifted. The corridors were lighter. The carriages on the road to Windsor had their windows closed. The frogs were given away to a curious clergyman who took them with their cases to a country parish where they were eventually allowed to escape into a pond and join the local population. The question that the household asked, in private, in the days after her death, was the question they had been asking for 30 years. The question of why the Queen had loved her. The question of why Charlotte, who could see through almost everyone, had been blind to this one woman. The answers proposed at the time were various. Loyalty to the country of her birth. Loyalty to the woman who had crossed the sea with her in 1761, a trust that had been formed in the first weeks in England, and that had hardened into a permanent fixture of the Queen's emotional life. A debt that the Queen felt she owed to the only person in the household who had known her since she was 17. None of these answers fully explained it. None of them ever would. The Queen had loved her, and the Queen had kept her at the centre of the household for the whole of her reign, and the only person who could have answered the question was Charlotte herself, and Charlotte never did. The household closed over the gap. The post of first keeper of the robes was filled. Burney, who had left 5 years earlier, heard the news in her own home in the country and recorded it in her diary with a single carefully composed sentence that gave away nothing. The court that Schwellenberg had ruled by fear settled, almost imperceptibly, into something closer to peace. And Charlotte, who had loved her without explanation, mourned her without explanation, and walked, in the quiet weeks that followed, through a household that was, for the first time in decades, no longer afraid. Frances Burney was 34 years old in the summer of 1786. She had published 2 novels. The first, Evelina, had appeared anonymously in 1778 and had become an immediate sensation. The second, Cecilia, had followed in 1782 and had confirmed the reputation. She was, by any measure available to a woman of her age and class in England, one of the most celebrated authors of her generation. Dr. Johnson had praised her. Mrs. Thrale had taken her into the literary circle at Streatham. The Burney Parlour in St. Martin's Street, presided over by her father, the music historian, was one of the better-known intellectual rooms in London. She had a reputation. She had work in progress. She had, by the standards of an unmarried gentlewoman of moderate means, a life as good as the world was likely to offer her. In June of 1786, her father came to her with a proposal. The Queen had a vacancy in her household. The post was second keeper of the robes. The salary was £200 a year. The duties involved attending the Queen at her dressing, accompanying her on journeys and assisting in the management of her wardrobe. Dr. Burney had made inquiries and had been informed that the place could be hers. He thought she should take it. He thought, more accurately, that he wanted her to take it. The honour to the family would be considerable. The connection to the Queen would lift them all. He pressed his case with the genial, unbending obstinacy of a father who has decided what is best for a daughter and is now waiting for her to agree. Mrs. Thrale, by this time Mrs. Piozzi, and out of favour with the family for her remarriage, sent a warning that the post would destroy her. Mrs. Delaney, the elderly artist who was already a friend of the Queen's, and who had recommended Burney for the position, urged her gently in the other direction. Burney's own instinct was to refuse. Her instinct was overruled. She accepted the post in the second week of July. She took up her duties at Windsor on the 17th. She would write, 20 years later, that she had been led into the place by people who loved her. She would also write that the place had nearly broken her. The first morning set the pattern. She was woken before 6 by a quiet knock at her door. The wardrobe woman was already in the corridor, ready to escort her to the Queen's apartments. She dressed in her court clothes by the light of a single lamp. She walked through the silent palace with the apprehension of a woman entering a room she has not been allowed to study in advance. She arrived in the Queen's dressing chamber at 6:15. The Queen was already awake. The senior dressers were already at work. Schwellenberg was already in the room, watching everything, missing nothing, ready to correct a wrong move with a German monosyllable that would settle the corridor for the rest of the day. The dressing took an hour and a half. Burney's role was minor at first, holding pins, fetching items from a side table, standing in attendance while the more experienced women did the work. She stood without moving. She stood in court dress. She stood in shoes that were not made for standing. She stood in the silence that the Queen preferred during the morning toilette, a silence broken only by the quiet exchanges of the working women and by the occasional remark from the Queen herself. The standing was, on that first morning, manageable. It would not, across the years that followed, get easier after the dressing came breakfast. Burney did not eat with the Queen. She ate at the household table, which was Schwellenberg's table, which was a torment that occupied the next hour of every day she was on duty. She ate quickly. She ate as little as she could without being noticed. She returned to the Queen's apartments and took up her duties for the rest of the morning, copying letters, taking dictation, fetching whatever the Queen required, standing again, always standing, the standing accumulating in the muscles of her legs in a way that she had not anticipated when she first read the description of the post. The afternoon was sometimes worse. The afternoon was sometimes the worst part of the day, because the body had stopped feeling the standing as pain and had begun to feel it as a kind of hollow exhaustion that no rest in the evening could repair. The evening had its own rituals. The Queen wished to be entertained at certain hours. She liked to have one of her ladies read to her. She liked to play cards. She liked to listen to music and to require an opinion on it from whoever was nearest. The second keeper of the robes was expected to make herself useful in any of these ways that were called for. Burney had a fine hand at reading aloud. She had been doing it for her family since she was a child. She read to the Queen with the steady competence that had been praised in her drawing rooms in London. The Queen listened with the gentle attention of a woman who appreciated good reading, and the evenings, which were the part of court life that should have been a pleasure, were instead the part of the day when Burney was most aware of how far she had come from the kind of evening she would have chosen. The boredom was the worst of it. The standing was painful. The carriage was a misery. The meals were a daily test of restraint, but the boredom was an emptiness that ate at her like acid, and that no other privation she had ever known had prepared her for. She was a woman of letters. She had been raised in a household where every meal had brought a new conversation about Italian opera or recent verse or the prose of the 18th century. She had spent her youth in a circle of women who argued about books over their tea. She had grown into a working novelist. The court contained, in the years of her residence, almost nothing of this kind of life. The conversation was guarded. The reading was approved by the Queen and limited in range. The wit of the great parlours of London did not reach the apartments where she now spent her days. She had come from a house full of voices into silences. The silences were what she could not get used to. She kept the diary. She had kept a diary since her teens. The court diary was different from the others, written in stolen minutes, written in a small hand on cheap paper, written behind a closed door in the brief intervals between obligations. It is the most extraordinary record of court life that the 18th century produced. It is candid in ways that the diaries written for publication were not. It records the woman she sat with at meals. It records the corridors she walked. It records the Queen herself, in the small detail and the unguarded gesture, and it records her with an accuracy that no portraitist of the period quite achieved. The diary was her resistance. The diary, in the long view, was the most valuable thing produced inside Charlotte's household during the entire reign. The writing of the diary was a small daily heroism. There was no time set aside for it. The household provided no small private hour at the desk. Burney wrote in the early morning before the dressing began, when she had been called by the wardrobe woman at 5:30, and could spare 10 or 15 minutes at her own table before walking down to the Queen's apartments. She wrote in the brief intervals between the dressing and the household breakfast, when the senior dressers were finishing the hair, and her own duties did not require her in the room. She wrote at night by a single candle, when she had returned to her room after the long day, and was in theory preparing for sleep. She wrote, more often than not, against her own exhaustion. The diary entries grow shorter in the years of her time at court. The handwriting tightens, the paragraphs fall away. The voice that had been spacious and reflective in the diaries of her London years became, in the diary of her court years a voice of compression, of half-finished thoughts, of small, precise observations recorded almost in shorthand. The compression was not by choice. The compression was what the household allowed. She did not write fiction during her court years. The novel that had been in progress when she accepted the post, the manuscript of what would become Camilla, was set aside. She lacked the time. She lacked the energy. She lacked, more than either, the kind of imaginative space that fiction required, the long, slow inner room where a novelist lives with her characters across months of accumulating attention. The court did not permit that room. The court filled the day, and the day filled the mind. And the mind, by the time Burney was free of her duties in the late evening, had nothing left to give to the imagined company of a heroine she had been thinking about for years. The novel waited. It would wait the full 5 years of her time at Windsor. She would return to it only after her resignation, in the country, in her father's house, in the long restorative period of the recovery she required, after the post had at last released her. Camilla would be published in 1796, 6 years after she left the Queen's service, and would be one of the most successful novels of the decade. And a novel had been waiting in her all those years, while she stood in the Queen's dressing chamber and copied letters and ate at Schwellenberg's table. The court had not killed her work. The court had only postponed it. The recovery, when it came, was complete. The Queen knew about the diary, in a general way. The Queen did not read it. The Queen was, by the standards of a royal employer in the late 18th century, an exceptionally considerate one. She did not raise her voice. She did not blame her servants for problems they could not fix. She inquired after their families. She remembered names. She gave thoughtful gifts. Burney's relationship with her was, on the Queen's side, warm. On Burney's side, it was warm as well, complicated by the impossibility of her position, by the exhaustion she could not show, and by the diary in which she was simultaneously recording the woman she was beginning to love, and the establishment that was destroying her. The Queen was kind. The Queen was also, by the architecture of the household, the woman in the next room. She lived behind a door that Burney could not open without permission. She was attended by ladies whom Burney did not outrank. She knew that her second keeper of the robes was unhappy, and she did not know how not, as a queen, possess the imaginative capacity to understand what it was like to live the life her servants lived. Charlotte never rescued Burney. Charlotte never thought of rescuing her. The kindness was real, and the limits of the kindness were also real, and Burney lived inside both at the same time. She fell ill in the 4th year. Her health, which had been moderate to start with, was deteriorating under the regime of the household. The eyes were chronic now. The chest was weakening. She lost weight. She lost colour. Her family began to write to her in a tone that suggested they had noticed. Her father, who had pressed her into the post, finally, slowly, began to admit to himself that the post was killing her. Dr. Burney withdrew his support. He asked his old friends in the household to help his daughter resign with honour. Resignation was not simple. The household did not like to release its members. The Queen was attached to Burney by this time, and Schwellenberg, though she had no affection for the younger woman, was not eager to lose a subordinate. She had spent 5 years training in her own methods. The negotiations took most of a year. Burney's health continued to decline. The Queen, when the request was finally framed, accepted it with a graciousness that Burney recorded in the diary with something close to gratitude. A pension of £100 a year for life was settled on her. She left the household in the summer of 1791. She had been there for 5 years and 1 week. The leaving was a strange thing. She had thought of it for years. She had imagined, in the long quiet of the carriage rides and the longer quiet of the antechambers, the day she would walk out of the Queen's apartments for the last time and would not be coming back. The day, when it came, was not what she had imagined. It was a quiet morning in early July. The Queen had granted her a final audience. The Queen had thanked her for her years of service in the small, careful phrasing the Queen used for such occasions. The Queen had given her a small gift, a piece of plate engraved with the Queen's monogram. The Queen had given her a portrait of herself, painted in miniature, which Burney would keep in a small case on her writing desk for the rest of her life. The Queen had embraced her briefly, in the small dressing chamber where they had spent so many of the mornings of the past 5 years. Burney had not wept. The Queen had not wept. The two women had stood for a moment looking at each other in the small bright light of the dressing chamber window, and the moment had passed, and Burney had withdrawn, and the Queen had turned to the day's other business, and the relationship that had occupied so much of Burney's life had ended in less than a quarter of an hour. She walked out through the corridors she had walked through every morning for 5 years. The wardrobe women curtsied to her. The footman bowed. The pages stepped aside as she passed. The household had been informed, in the small private way the household informed itself of such things, that the second keeper of the robes was leaving that morning, and the household had assembled at the various points along her route to pay her the small farewell that the rules permitted. She passed Schwellenberg on the staircase. Schwellenberg said something to her in German that she did not entirely catch. She returned the words she would have used in any other context, with the small, precise courtesy that she had been practicing for 5 years. She did not, at any point in the descent, look back. She reached the carriage that was waiting in the courtyard. She got in. The carriage moved out through the gates. She was free. The freedom did not, in the first weeks, feel like freedom. It felt like the slow, strange recovery of a body that has been holding itself in a particular shape for too long. The eyes continued to trouble her. The chest continued to weaken. She slept a great deal. She walked in the gardens of her father's house in Chelsea, at a pace that her family, watching her, found alarmingly slow. She did not, in the first months, take up her novel again. She did not, for some time, take up her diary in any sustained way. She was, in the precise medical sense, exhausted. The recovery would take more than a year. By the end of that year, she had begun to write. By the end of 2 years, she was at work on Camilla. By the time of her marriage in 1793, she was, by every measure her family applied, well again. The recovery had been complete, but the recovery had cost her more than the post had been worth, and she would write, in the years afterwards, about the long shadow it had left in her, the kind of shadow that no full recovery quite removes. She married in 1793. Her husband was a French officer, a moderate royalist refugee named Alexander D'Arblay, met through an English friend. The marriage was poor in money and rich in everything else. They had 1 son. They lived in modest happiness in the country, in occasional residence in France, in eventual return to England. Burney lived to see her diaries circulating in the literary world, and to know that they would be the foundation of every history of the court she had served. She died in 1840 at the age of 87. She had outlived the Queen by 22 years. She had outlived almost everyone she had served alongside. She left the diaries to her niece. The first volumes were published a few years after her death. They have been in print, in some form, ever since. Every line we have about Charlotte's court comes ultimately from the small hand of the woman who copied the household down at the end of her exhausted days. Every sketch of Schwellenberg, every account of a corridor and a curtsy and a woman fainting in the Queen's presence, in the brief minutes before sleep, on cheap paper that she kept in a locked drawer. The Duchess of Ancaster, on the morning of the coronation in September of 1761, had stood for 2 hours in full ceremonial dress before the carriage was called to take her to Westminster. Her own hair had been dressed at 5. Her own jewels, family pieces brought out from the bank for the occasion, had been placed on her at 6. The court mantua she wore, a heavy gown of blue silk embroidered with silver thread, had been fitted 3 times in the preceding week and was now stiff around her shoulders in a way that would not relax all day. By the time she reached the Abbey, she had been on her feet for 3 hours and would not sit down for another 6. She did all of this without comment. She had been raised to it. The mistress of the robes did not complain about the work. The work was the privilege. What she did at the Abbey, when she arranged the crown on Charlotte's head, is the kind of detail that a well-trained mistress of the robes performed without anyone being able to say afterwards that she had performed it. The crown slipped. The Duchess corrected the slip. The pearl in the band was repositioned. The diamond at the front was angled by a 1/4 inch. The young Queen sat very still. The thing was done. The procession moved on. And the Duchess of Ancaster, 18 years senior to the Queen, and infinitely more practiced in the management of a public occasion, gave the bishop holding the orb a small and almost imperceptible nod that meant, "Please proceed." The mistress of the robes was the woman who held the public ceremony together. She did not, in the day-to-day life of the household, have many duties. She was not at the Queen's dressing every morning. She did not carry messages or supervise the wardrobe. She appeared at the great events. She presided. She made the public face of the Queen's court possible by being, herself, the face of the public side of the household, a duchess in court dress, beside the Queen, at every moment when the country was watching. The ladies of the bedchamber were a different proposition. There were 6 of them. They served 2 months at a time, and they were resident in the household during their tour of duty, and the work, while not laborious by the standards of the lower tiers, was steady. They handed the Queen her gloves. They walked behind her in processions. They sat with her at receptions, although they never sat in her presence except by permission. They received foreign visitors on her behalf when the Queen herself was at her dressing or at her dinner. They were, in the proper sense of the word, companions, and the women who held the post fell into 2 broad categories. There were the women who endured it, who attended their 2 months because their husbands required them to attend, who counted the days, and there were the women who came to love it, who became over the years something close to friends. Lady Harcourt was the second kind. Elizabeth Vernon, Countess Harcourt, came to the bedchamber in the 1780s as the wife of the 2nd Earl Harcourt, and held the post for over 30 years. She was intelligent, well-read, fluent in French and Italian, an amateur botanist of some seriousness, and a woman who treated the Queen with the easy affection of a friend rather than the studied deference of a courtier. The friendship became important to Charlotte. Charlotte, who had no other woman of her own age in the household whom she could speak to as an equal, found in Lady Harcourt the kind of companion that her position usually denied her. She visited the Harcourts at Newnham Courtenay, the family seat in Oxfordshire, on multiple occasions. The visits were the closest she ever came to a private holiday, the kind of stay where she could walk in the gardens without an entourage, and read in the library without being watched, where she could converse over dinner about something other than the household and the children and the king. It was through Lady Harcourt that Mrs. Delaney came into the Queen's life. Mary Delaney was already 76 when she met Charlotte in 1776. She had been one of the great figures of the 18th century literary and artistic world, the friend of Swift and Handel, and a circle of women whose conversation and accomplishments had shaped the cultural life of 3 generations. She was a widow. She lived modestly. She had begun, at the age of 73, the project that would make her famous to the next century, the creation of paper mosaics of botanical subjects, cut with scissors from coloured paper and assembled with extraordinary precision. The images of flowers were so accurate that botanists were already using them as references. Charlotte met her at Newnham. Charlotte fell, almost immediately, into something close to reverence. Mrs. Delaney became a fixture of the Queen's last decades, given a small house at Windsor by the King at Charlotte's request, attended by the royal family in her old age. Charlotte addressed her with a tenderness that the Queen otherwise reserved for her own children. Mrs. Delaney was the Queen's late-life favourite. She was also the figure who had recommended Frances Burney for the post that Burney had then come, slowly, to regret. The connections inside the household were never simple. The friendship between the Queen and the elderly artist was one of the small extraordinary things of the late reign. Mrs. Delaney had been a young woman in the years of the first George. She had married against her will an old Cornish landowner who had treated her badly and whose death she had received with relief. She had married again, late for love, the Reverend Patrick Delaney, a Dublin clergyman of distinction, and the marriage had been, by every account she had given of it, the central happiness of her life. He had died in 1768. She had been, by the time the Queen met her, 8 years a widow and approaching the 8th decade of a life that had run through almost every cultural event of the 18th century. She was a kind of living archive. She had heard Handel play. She had been corresponded with by Swift. She had known in her youth the Duchess of Marlborough, who had been the close friend and bitter enemy of Queen Anne. She was, in her old age, the keeper of a memory that nobody else in England still possessed. Charlotte loved her for this. The flowers were extraordinary. Mrs. Delaney had a name for them. She called them her hortus siccus, her dry garden, her paper herbarium. She made them at a small table by a window with a north light, with a pair of scissors so fine that no shop in London could replace them when they wore out, with sheets of coloured paper that she had been collecting and dyeing herself for years. The work required steady hands. The hands of a woman of nearly 80 were not, in any reliable sense, steady. Mrs. Delaney worked anyway. She worked by the end with a magnifying glass and the patience of a woman who knew that the time left was short. She completed nearly 1,000 of the mosaics before her sight failed in the last year of her life. The British Museum has them now. The colours have not faded. The Queen brought the princesses to see Mrs. Delaney. The princesses brought their drawings to show her. The old artist, who had been teaching young women to draw since the 1730s, gave them advice that they remembered for the rest of their lives. She told the princesses to look more carefully than they had been looking. She told them that the eye trains the hand. She told them that any object worth drawing was worth drawing slowly. The princesses, in their letters from later life, would still quote her. She had been a teacher of the kind they had not in the schoolroom encountered. The schoolroom had taught them the conventions of drawing as a polite female accomplishment. Mrs. Delaney, in her drawing room with her north light and her 1,000 mosaics, had taught them what drawing actually was. She died in 1788 at 88. The Queen mourned her. The house at Windsor stood empty for a long time afterwards because no one in the household wanted to be the person who replaced Mrs. Delaney's small establishment with someone else's. The friendship had occupied the rooms. The friendship was over. The rooms remained as a kind of memorial. The table by the north window with its scissors and its papers still arranged where she had left them. The small library of botanical books still on its shelf. The chair where the Queen had sat when she came to visit, still in its place by the fire. The household, in the months after Mrs. Delaney's death, took the rooms apart with a slowness that was its own form of mourning. The objects were dispersed to those who had loved her. The books went to the Royal Library. The mosaics went, eventually, to the museum. The chair where the Queen had sat went, by the Queen's own request, to her own apartments at Windsor, and stayed there for the rest of her life. The drawing rooms were the showpiece. Twice a week, when the court was in residence at St. James's, the Queen held a formal reception. The term had been generalised to mean the entire occasion, the assembly of the court, the presentation of debutantes, the kissing of the Queen's hand by women being formally introduced to society. They were, until 1958, the central social ritual of the British year for the families who attended them. They were, in the late 18th century, an exhausting and elaborate performance. The dress was prescribed. Court dress was not the same as fashionable dress. Court dress had been fixed by custom and by direct royal preference, in a form that had ceased to be fashionable 30 years earlier and that would continue into the next century to require what the rest of London had stopped wearing. The hooped petticoat was mandatory. The skirts were wide. The bodice was stiff. The lappets, the long lace streamers attached at the headdress, were specified in length and arrangement. The feathers in the hair were specified in number, in colour, in the angle at which they sat. A young woman being presented at her first drawing-room was dressed by women who had been dressing women for these occasions for a generation. The dressing took most of a day. The result was a costume that the wearer had usually never worn before in her life and would mostly wear only on the few state occasions of her later years. The curtsy was a separate art. The court curtsy was deep, almost to the ground, and it was performed without bending the back, without dropping the eyes, without losing the line of the train that fell behind the wearer for several feet. Young women were rehearsed for it for weeks before their presentation. They practiced in the drawing rooms of their mothers' houses. They practiced wearing the hoops they would wear on the day. They practiced in front of mirrors. The descent was the easy part. The rise was harder. The walk backwards, away from the Queen, without tripping on the train and without turning around, was harder still. Women had fallen at presentations. Women had fainted. Most managed it. The successful presentation was the start of the rest of a young woman's social life, and the families who could afford the dress and the dancing master and the rehearsals counted the cost as money well spent. The Queen received the presentations with steady patience. She had stood through the dressing of an hour and a half, and would stand through the next 4 hours of presentations, one girl after another, the hand offered, the hand kissed, the small remark, the next girl. She was good at it. She remembered names. She asked the right questions. She made each young woman feel, for the brief moment of her presentation, that the Queen of England had genuinely seen her. The drawing room itself was a particular space, transformed for the occasion. The tall windows of the great drawing room at St. James's were uncovered to admit the afternoon light. The chandeliers were lit even in daylight, with candles in their hundreds, throwing the small yellow points of light against the gilt of the cornices and the deep red of the silk hangings. The carpet was rolled up. The floor, a parquet of inlaid woods that had been laid in the time of William III, was polished by the household servants in the morning until the figures of the inlay caught the light from above. The chairs that stood against the walls in the ordinary days of the year were taken out. The room was emptied. The room became, for the 4 hours of the drawing-room, a single open space across which the Queen and her ladies stood at one end, and across which the long line of presentations advanced. The smell of the room was the smell of beeswax and silk, and the perfumes the women had been told not to wear too strongly, but had worn anyway, in defiance of the instruction, and of the powder that fell from the high hairdresses of the older ladies as they walked through the room. A fine white dust that the household servants would sweep up afterwards from the polished floor. The sound was the sound of voices kept low by the conventions of the occasion, of the small swish of trains across the wood, of the brief clear notes of names called out by the Lord Chamberlain at the Queen's elbow, of the small murmurs of the ladies who were waiting their turn and who were comparing notes on the gowns of the women ahead of them. There were no chairs in the room because the Queen did not sit. The Queen stood. The room understood that no one else might sit either, and so the women of court dress, in their hoops and their stays and their headdresses, stood for the full duration of the drawing-room, and the room was a forest of stationary figures, from which the queue of presentations moved one woman at a time toward the Queen at its centre. Halt at end. The young women being presented had been rehearsed for months. The rehearsals were conducted, in the great houses of London, by dancing masters and by elderly female relatives who had themselves been presented decades earlier and who remembered the precise mechanics of the curtsy and the train and the walk backwards. The walk backwards was the part that everyone feared. The presented woman, after the kiss of the Queen's hand and the brief exchange of words, was required to retire from the Queen's presence without turning her back, which is to say that she was required to walk backwards across an open space of polished parquet, wearing a hooped skirt of considerable circumference and trailing a train of 3 or 4 yards. She walked backwards by feel. She judged the distance to the wall by the small private signals her dancing master had taught her. She kicked her train, with each step, slightly to the side, the small practiced motion that prevented the heel from catching it and bringing the entire structure down. She kept her chin up. She kept her face composed. She walked backwards, by inches, until the Lord Chamberlain at the side of the room caught her eye with a small nod that meant she had reached the appointed distance and could turn. She turned. She passed out of the Queen's sight. She was returned to her family in the antechamber where they were waiting, and was at last allowed to sit down. The presentations were over by 6 in the evening. The Queen withdrew to her apartments. The room emptied of the women in their court dress. The Lord Chamberlain congratulated whichever member of his household had managed the lists of the day without error. The household servants came in to take the candles down, to dismantle the temporary stands, to roll the carpet back across the floor for the ordinary use of the room when the next day's business resumed. The drawing-room had been, for those 4 hours, the apex of female public life in England. By 7, the room was empty. By 8, it was being prepared for the next thing the household required of it, which might be a private supper for the King's brother, or a meeting of the Council of State, or a small chamber concert that the Queen had ordered, and the room would, by morning, have shed every trace of the afternoon's performance. The jewels were the most political of the Queen's possessions. She had a jewel keeper, a senior woman of the household, whose only duty was the management of the Queen's personal jewels and the ceremonial pieces from the royal collection. The jewels were inventoried daily. They were locked in a strong room that only the jewel keeper could open. They were brought out for each occasion in the combination that the Queen herself had specified: the diamonds for the King's birthday, the rubies for foreign visitors, the pearls for the more domestic occasions. The colour and weight of the jewellery a coded message that the courtiers could read. A Queen who wore the deep state diamonds for an unscheduled drawing-room was sending a signal that the court took seriously. A Queen who wore only the pearls was indicating a different level of state. The wardrobe women did the actual dressing. Mrs. Papendick, whose memoirs would later become another foundation source for the period, was one of them. She was the daughter of a German page and had grown up in the household, and she had married a German page herself, and she had been working at the Queen's wardrobe for the whole of her adult life. Her memoirs, written in old age and published only in the 19th century, give the lower tiers perspective on the same court that Burney was recording from above. Papendick loved the Queen. Papendick loved Schwellenberg, which is the most surprising element in her account, the only positive testimony of any length about the first keeper of the robes that has come down to us. The household was various. Not everyone in it suffered as Burney suffered. The view from the wardrobe was not dining table. The maids of honour wove through the drawing rooms. They were the youngest and they were the most watched. Eligible men noted their positions. Eligible men's mothers calculated their dowries. The maids of honour, in turn, watched the room with the practised attention of young women on duty in the largest marriage market in the country. The post was usually a transition. A young woman became a maid of honour in her late teens. She married, if the system worked as intended, in her early 20s. She left the household. The post turned over with the regularity of a season at a country house, and the Queen, who had seen the cycle 100 times, processed the comings and goings without expressed emotion. The King's birthday drawing-room was the most splendid event of the year. It was held on the 4th of June, the King's actual birthday, unless the date fell on a Sunday, in which case it was held on the day before or after. The whole court attended. Foreign ambassadors attended. The peers and peeresses of the kingdom attended in their state dress. The hall blazed with light. The orchestra played in the gallery. The Queen stood for the entire reception. often for 5 hours, receiving the procession of bows and curtsies that no other occasion in the year approached in scale. It was the moment when the household showed itself to the country at its full strength. Every woman in the Queen's service was on duty, every position was filled. The mistress of the robes presided, the ladies of the bedchamber attended, the maids of honour walked the room. The wardrobe women, hidden in the back rooms, pressed and steamed and repaired through the night before, ready for the next morning's repeat performance, because the King's birthday lasted, in some form, for 3 days. The smell of the room on a king's birthday was the smell of 1,000 candles, of court perfumes that had been formulated in Paris and shipped across the Channel, of silks that had been kept in cedar chests through the winter and brought out for the occasion, of bodies that had been washed at greater than weekly frequency for once, and that were, by the end of the long evening, beginning to remind the room of why the perfumes were necessary. The light was the gold yellow of beeswax in quantity. The shadows on the painted ceilings moved with the draught from the doors. The heat by midnight was considerable. Women fanned themselves not for ornament but for survival. The footmen, in their full state livery, stood along the walls with the carved patience of men who had been on their feet since the morning. They would be on their feet until the Queen retired and the lights were extinguished, and the work of cleaning the rooms began. It was the household at its peak. It was Charlotte's court showing itself to the kingdom, and in the middle of it, in the centre of the great drawing room, stood the Queen, in her full state diamonds, her hair powdered and feathered, her hand offered to a procession of women whose names she would, by the end of the evening, have remembered everyone. The seasons of the household had their own rhythm. The court was in residence at St. James's for the high social season, which meant January through April. The court moved to Windsor for the summer and the early autumn. The court moved to Kew at intervals throughout the year, particularly when the Queen was lying in, or when the King required the smaller establishment for his health. The wardrobe travelled with the household, which meant that the wardrobe women were on the road more weeks of the year than they were in residence at any one place, and the carriages and the wagons that conveyed the Queen's clothing between her residences formed a small caravan that the country saw at intervals along the roads of southern England. Christmas was at Windsor. The household closed in around the great fire in the castle hall and produced, every 25th of December, the small private celebration that the family preferred to the more elaborate public observances of the season. There was a service in the chapel. There was a dinner in the dining room. There were small private exchanges of gifts between the Queen and the children, and in later years the grown daughters. There was in the castle hall the carrying in of a tree, a German custom that Charlotte had introduced into the court in the early years of her reign, and that would, by the time of her granddaughter Victoria, become so widely associated with the British Christmas that the English would forget it had begun as the foreign import of a Mecklenburg princess homesick for the customs of her childhood. The summer at Windsor had its own customs: the morning rides in the great park, the afternoon visits to the gardens, the small private suppers in the lodge with the windows open onto the lawns. The court was smaller at Windsor than at St. James's. The pace was slower. The Queen, in the years before the first crisis, had loved Windsor for these reasons. The years after the first crisis would change her relationship with it, would make Windsor the place where the King was unwell, would attach to the gardens and the corridors the small sensory associations that any house acquires through long residence. But in the early years, in the seasons when the children were young and the King was still entirely himself, Windsor in summer had been the closest the Queen had ever come to a private life. In October of 1788, the King began to talk too quickly. It was the first sign. He had complained for some weeks of pain in his stomach, of cramping in his limbs, of a difficulty sleeping that was new to him, and the household, which was at Windsor for the autumn, had noticed the change without yet understanding what it meant. Then the speech changed. He began to talk for hours without pausing. He began to repeat himself. He began to address his attendants by names that were not their names. By the end of the month, he was sometimes speaking too rapidly to be understood. By the middle of November, he was being held down on his bed by male servants who had been called from the stables for the purpose. The Queen, in the rooms beside his, was sitting in a chair with her hands in her lap, listening to her husband shout at no one for an hour at a time. She locked her door. She had to. She loved him. She knew in the part of her that was still able to think clearly that he loved her. But the man behind the door was no longer the man she had married. The man behind the door had begun, in his crisis, to direct his confusion at her in ways that were sometimes affectionate and sometimes angry, ways that were always by the standards of any reasonable behaviour, beyond what a queen could be expected to endure. She locked her door at night. The princesses, who had nowhere else to go, came to her rooms in their nightgowns and slept in her bed and held on to her until the morning. The household held its breath. The political crisis that was about to follow, the Regency crisis of 1788 to 1789, played out in Westminster while the women at Windsor lived with the reality. The Prince of Wales, then 26 and increasingly impatient with his father's continued occupation of the throne, lobbied for a regency that would place him in effective power. The opposition supported him. The government resisted. The newspapers reported every twitch from the king's bedchamber as a political fact. Every fluctuation in his condition became a fluctuation in the share price of his son's ambition. The household watched its private grief turned into public theatre. The Queen, who had no power to silence the press and no inclination to engage with it, retreated further into the rooms where her husband was being attended by physicians whose treatments were almost as cruel as the illness. He was blistered. He was bled. He was put into a strait waistcoat. He was tied to his bed when he became violent. He was forced into cold baths. The methods of the period for treating what nobody knew was likely a porphyric attack, possibly compounded by some disorder of the mind that the medicine of the day could not name, were a combination of restraint and depletion. They often made the patient worse. The doctors quarrelled. A physician named Willis, brought in from a private asylum in Lincolnshire, claimed methods that the others did not endorse. The treatments competed with each other for primacy. The king suffered through all of them. He recovered. By the spring of 1789 he was speaking normally again, eating normally again, walking in the park without an attendant. The Regency Bill that had been working its way through Parliament was withdrawn. The household exhaled. The Queen, in the small chapel at Windsor, attended a service of thanksgiving with the princesses around her and Mrs. Delaney at her side, and a face that had aged 10 years in 6 months. The shadow did not leave. The king had recovered, but he was changed, and the household was changed with him. The court, which had divided its time between London and Windsor for the first quarter-century of the reign, now spent more of its time at Windsor. Charlotte preferred it, the country air, the smaller establishment. The absence of the political pressure that the London residences carried with them. All of these things suited a queen who had survived a long crisis and who wanted now to keep her husband as comfortable as the world would allow. The lodge at Windsor became the working centre of the family's life. The castle, after extensive alterations, would later succeed it. The princesses learned to read in those rooms. The king learned to ride out again. The queen learned, slowly, to live with the knowledge that the recovery was provisional. In the gardens at Kew, in the year that followed the first crisis, an episode took place that Frances Burney recorded in her diary with the breathless clarity of a woman writing in shock. She had been walking in the gardens in the early evening. She had stepped beyond the formal boundaries of the Queen's apartments to take a quiet path she had been told was unfrequented. She turned a corner, and there, walking towards her on the gravel, was the king. He was alone. His attendants, who had been instructed never to leave him alone, had lost him at the gate. He saw her. He recognized her. He walked towards her. She ran. She ran without dignity, the train of her dress over her arm, the cap loose on her head, across the grass and through a hedge, and along a path she did not know. He pursued her. He called her name. He sounded, in her account, more pleading than threatening, but the pursuit went on for a quarter of a mile before her breath gave out, and she stopped and turned and faced him. He came up to her. He was breathing hard. She was breathing harder. He took her by the shoulders, and she braced for whatever was about to happen, and he embraced her gently, as a man embraces an old friend he has not seen for many months. He kissed her on the cheek. He told her he was glad to see her. He told her that he was sorry to have frightened her. The attendants, who had been chasing him for 10 minutes by this point, came up the path and took his arms and began to lead him quietly back. He went with them. He looked back at her once. He waved. She wrote it down that night. The diary preserves the encounter as one of the strangest moments of her time at court, the moment in which the man she had been seeing only at a distance for years, in his diminished condition, had revealed himself to be still entirely there, still recognizing her, still capable of the manners of a gentleman in the middle of an episode that had begun to look like a final decline. He was not finally declining. Not yet. He would have more good years. The Kew Gardens that evening, after the king had been led away by his attendants, settled into the kind of stillness that follows an event the witnesses do not yet know how to describe. The sun was setting. The shadows of the great trees were long across the grass. Burney sat on a bench and steadied her breath. Her cap was loose. Her train was muddied. Her heart, in the small precise phrase she would use that night in her diary, was not yet her own. She walked back to the Queen's apartments by the long way around, taking time to compose herself. She said nothing about the encounter to anyone in the household until she could make sense of it. The diary was where she made sense of things. The diary was where she was always alone with what had happened. Lady Charlotte Finch was still raising the youngest children through this period. She was now in her 60s. Her own husband had died. She had moved into apartments at Windsor and at the lodge at Kew, and she continued to oversee the schoolroom of the daughters who were still in residence, the younger princesses Mary and Sophia and Amelia. Amelia, the youngest of all the royal children, was her particular charge. Amelia had been born in 1783, the 15th child, and Lady Charlotte Finch, who had taken her in her arms at 3 days old, was the woman she went to for everything that did not concern her parents. Amelia was, in everyone's account, the favourite. The king adored her. The queen doted on her. The household indulged her. The household feared increasingly for her health. She was a tubercular child. She had been ill since she was a teenager, and the illness, which the period understood imperfectly, was the kind of slow consumptive decline that the family had not yet had to face in any of its members. She was treated. She was sent to Weymouth for the sea air. She was given the gentlest regime the household could devise. She fell in love, at some point in her late teens, with a man named Charles Fitzroy, an equerry of the king's, 21 years older than she was. The attachment was hopeless. The king would never have approved a marriage between his daughter and a courtier of no rank. Amelia knew it. She kept the attachment private. She kept it for the rest of her life. The letters between her and Fitzroy, which survive, are the letters of a woman who had given herself, in her own mind, to a man she would never be allowed to marry. The wedding ring she wore in the months before her death was a ring that he had given her in a private ceremony of their own that the household never witnessed. She died in November of 1810. She was 27. She had been in decline for years, and the household had been preparing for the end. But the actual death, when it came, broke the king's mind for the second and final time. He had been, since the first crisis, prone to relapses that the doctors had managed and that had not become public. The death of Amelia was the wound that the recoveries could not absorb. He stopped sleeping. He began to talk to people who were not in the room. He began, by the early weeks of 1811, to address his dead daughter in the corridors as if she were still alive, walking beside him, listening to him, the small companion of his last clear years. The relapses had begun in 1801, 12 years after the first crisis. The king had been at Kew when the symptoms returned. The talking too quickly, the pain in the limbs, the disordered sleep. The household, which had hoped that the first crisis had been an isolated event, understood within 48 hours that it had not been. The doctors were sent for. The Willises, the family of the physician who had handled the first crisis, were brought back. The Queen, who had spent 12 years cautiously rebuilding a life around the belief that the recovery had been complete, locked her door again. The household held its breath again. The 1801 attack lasted weeks. It passed. The king recovered, though more slowly than the first time, and to a less complete state than the first time, and he resumed his life with the small, careful adjustments that the household made around him to prevent a third recurrence. There was a third recurrence. It came in 1804. It was shorter than the 1801 attack. It was, by the small private accounting of the household, more disturbing than the previous two, because it had become clear by the end of it that the underlying condition was now permanent. The king would have intervals of clarity. The doctors could no longer, with any confidence, predict which of the two states he would be in from 1 week to the next. The household began to live, after 1804, in the steady twilight of a household whose master was no longer reliably himself. The Queen lived through these years with the quiet endurance of a woman who had been left no other option. The princesses lived through them with her. The household worked around the king's condition, in the small, careful ways that any household works around an illness it cannot cure, and the years between 1804 and 1810 passed in the particular muted register of those small, careful adjustments. There were no great dramas. There were small ones. A dinner that the king could not attend, a drawing room that had to be cancelled, a visit from a foreign ambassador that had to be conducted by the Queen alone because the king could not be relied upon to manage the conversation. The country in the early 1800s was at war with France. The political pressure on the household was unrelenting. The Queen managed it. The Queen had been managing things by then for 40 years. By the spring of 1811 he was permanently confined. The regency was instituted. The Prince of Wales, who had wanted it for 20 years, finally had it. The king was moved into rooms in the castle from which he would not emerge in a useful condition again. He lived for 9 more years. He saw nobody from the wider world. He wandered his apartments and played the harpsichord and spoke to imagined companions. Charlotte, who had loved him for 50 years, visited him sometimes and was sometimes recognized and sometimes not. The visits, which had once been the central event of her day, became, in his last years, the saddest hour of her week. She was 66 in the year of his final collapse. She had been Queen of Great Britain for 50 years. She had buried her favourite daughter the November before. She had locked her door against her husband 23 years earlier, and had not, in any meaningful sense, opened it since. The household at Windsor was the household that would carry her through the rest of her life. The court that the women around her had built, the duchesses and the ladies of the bedchamber and the wardrobe women and the German keepers, was in those rooms in those years the only home she had left. The gentle paper-cut artist and the old governess were still part of it. They held her up because that was what they had been trained to do, and because by the end they loved her, and because there was, in any case, no one else. By the early 1800s, Charlotte had 6 grown daughters and almost nothing to show for them. Charlotte the eldest, her namesake, had married, against the king's reluctance, the King of Württemberg in 1797, and had gone to Germany. The other 5, Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia, were still living with their parents at Windsor in their 30s. They called the place, in their letters to each other, and in conversation among themselves when no one else was listening, the nunnery. The word was bitter. It was not affectionate. They used it because the place felt like one. They lived in apartments at the castle and at the lodge. They went out only on the carefully managed occasions that the Queen approved. They danced at private balls in private rooms with men who had been vetted and who would not be allowed to court them. They had their letters opened. They had their friendships discouraged. They had been, in the years of their youth, when marriages might have been arranged for them, kept at home by a father who could not bear the thought of parting with his girls, and by a mother who, as the king's condition deteriorated, could not bear to add the sorrow of his daughter's departures to the sorrow she was already carrying. The princesses were not the youngest of the daughters in any other royal house in Europe. They were of age. They should have been queens of their own small kingdoms by their 30s, with husbands and children and households. They had none of these. They had instead the routine of Windsor, the same rooms, the same attendants, the same parents who in their different ways were now permanent presences in the daughters' lives, long past the period when daughters would normally have moved on. The day at the nunnery began, for the princesses, at 7. They were called by their personal maids and dressed by the women who had been dressing them since their teens. They breakfasted together in a small dining room set aside for them, and they spent the morning in the activities the Queen approved. There was reading, there was sewing, there was correspondence with the women who had been their friends in their younger years and who were now, in most cases, married and living in their own establishments far from Windsor. There was practice on the harpsichord and on the harp, instruments at which several of the princesses excelled and at which all of them had been trained. There was the painting of botanical specimens, a discipline Mrs. Delany had begun teaching them in her old age, and that they had continued in the years since her death. There was, for those of the princesses who liked it, drawing in pencil and in chalk. There was, for those who did not, a long quiet morning in the small drawing-room where the Queen approved the kind of feminine occupation that did not require speech or movement. In the afternoon they walked. The walks were prescribed. They were not allowed to walk alone. They walked in pairs, accompanied by a lady who had been assigned for the day, and they walked along the gravelled paths that had been laid out by Capability Brown decades earlier, and that they had walked along since they were small girls. The paths did not change. The boundaries did not change. The companions changed with the rotation of the household. The princesses had walked these paths so many times that they knew by memory the small details of every yard, the exact spot where the rose bed turned, the precise angle of the box hedge at the far end, the view from the eastern walk of the small temple on the rising ground beyond the gardens. They walked in the sun and rain. They walked because walking was what was prescribed. They walked because there was very little else to do. The evenings were the worst. The princesses, who had no friends to entertain them and no permission to attend the entertainments of others, spent their evenings in the Queen's drawing-room. They sat with their mother. They listened to one of the readers go through the same approved volume of sermons that they had heard read aloud the previous Tuesday and the Tuesday before. They played cards in the small private circle of the family party. They went to bed at 10 or at 11, in the rooms they had occupied for years, and they slept in the beds that the women of their household had turned down for them, and they got up the next morning at 7 and began the same day again. The letters they wrote to each other in the years of their 30s and 40s are the saddest documents in the family papers. They are full of small jokes and small kindnesses and small reports of the family state. They are also full, between the lines, of a steady simmering resentment that the daughters could not direct openly at their parents, because the love was real, the love was complicated, the love was the very thing that had kept them at home. The mother who held them was the mother who had loved them. They could not blame her without breaking themselves, so they did not blame her. They wrote about other things. They wrote about the weather. They wrote about new books. The letters to each other were the central interior life of the princesses. They wrote to each other when they were in different houses. The letters between the princesses at Windsor and Charlotte, the eldest in Württemberg, after her marriage and her departure, are voluminous, weekly, sometimes daily. The princess in Germany, the only one of them who had escaped the nunnery, wrote home to her sisters with the close attention of a woman who had not forgotten the shape of the trap she had got out of. She sent them news. She sent them small presents from the German towns she now lived among. The letters were read at the nunnery in the small private intervals when no one else was watching. The letters were folded and kept in the locked cabinets of the princesses' bedrooms. The letters were, for the sisters at home, the closest they ever came to leaving. Charlotte loved them. There was never any doubt of that. The queen who walked with her daughters in the Windsor Gardens in her old age was the same queen who had knelt on the nursery floor in the 1770s to admire a drawing of a horse that looked more like a dog. The love was continuous. And Charlotte, who could not have explained the trap to herself any more than her daughters could explain it in their letters, kept them. She kept them because the king's illness made their absence intolerable. She kept them because her own emotional life had narrowed in her late years to the daily presence of the women who had grown up around her. She kept them because in the end she did not know how to let them go. Augusta was the second daughter. She was tall, athletic, intelligent, and quietly determined, and she fell in love at some point in the 1790s with a general named Sir Brent Spencer. He was older than she was. He was unsuitable in the king's eyes, which was the only set of eyes that mattered. The relationship was conducted in private over many years. Augusta wrote to him. Augusta exchanged tokens with him. There is some evidence, in the letters that survive, that the two of them considered themselves married in some private and unrecognized sense, that a ceremony of their own may have taken place, that the attachment was, by the end of Augusta's life, the central emotional fact of her existence. She never married him publicly. She never married anyone publicly. She lived to be 61. She died unmarried at Clarence House. The papers of her relationship with Spencer were collected by her sister Mary after her death, and were preserved in a way that suggests Mary thought they mattered. Augusta's life was the life that the nunnery shaped in its purest form. She rose at the same hour every morning. She walked the same gravel paths in the same gardens. She sat with her mother in the same drawing room and read aloud from the same approved books. She rode out, when she was permitted, on the same horse along the same routes. She corresponded with her sisters in the small, precise hand she had been taught at her writing desk in the schoolroom. She was, in her own letters, witty. She was capable. She had a shrewd assessment of the political world that she heard discussed at dinner and was not allowed to comment on. The general she loved fought in the wars and rose in his profession and grew old in his uniform, and the woman who had attached herself to him in her 20s remained at home in her parents' house until her parents had both died. By the time she was free to live as she wished, she was almost 60, and the years of being kept had become the only life she knew how to live. Elizabeth was the third daughter. She was the practical one, the one with a turn for administration and a head for figures, and she had been waiting, with steady patience, for a man whom her father would approve. He never approved one. By the time the king was permanently ill and the marriage decisions had passed to her brother, the regent, Elizabeth was 47. The husband who was found for her, the hereditary prince of Hesse-Homburg, was a German princeling of moderate means and undistinguished appearance. The marriage took place in 1818. She wrote to a friend on the day of the wedding that it was the happiest day of her life. She was 47 years old. She had waited 30 years for the privilege of leaving home. Mary, the fourth daughter, eventually married her cousin the Duke of Gloucester in 1816. He was not a love match. He was, in the family's private estimation, a tedious and self-important man whose chief recommendation was that he was royal and available. Mary married him for the same reason Elizabeth would marry her German prince. She wanted a household of her own. She wanted to leave the castle. The marriage was not happy in the conventional sense, but it was, by the standards of the nunnery, a freedom. Mary, who had been a beauty in her youth and was still elegant in her 40s, ran a court of her own at Bagshot Park for the rest of her life. Sophia, the fifth daughter, was the most tragic. She had been a delicate child and had grown into a delicate young woman, and she had attached herself in the late 1790s to a man named Major General Thomas Garth, an equerry of the King's, 33 years older than she was. He was by every account an unprepossessing man with a large purple birthmark across one side of his face. The princess was by every account in love with him. In the summer of 1800, when Sophia was 23, she gave birth to a child. The pregnancy was concealed. The household, which knew everything, agreed to know nothing. Sophia was sent to Weymouth on grounds of ill health. The baby, a boy named Thomas, was born in early August. He was given to Garth to raise, was given the surname Garth, and grew up as the son of a senior court official whose paternal connection to him no one in the household would ever publicly admit. He lived to adulthood. He claimed his royal parentage in his middle years. The claim was met with a silence that was its own confirmation. The cost to Sophia was severe. Her health, which had been poor before, was permanently damaged. She did not marry. She did not see her child grow up in any normal sense, although Garth, who seems to have been a decent man within the limits of the situation, allowed her some visits in the early years. She lived the rest of her life at Windsor, then at Kensington Palace, in a kind of suspended grief that was occasionally lifted by visits from her sisters and by the long correspondence she kept up with the boy in his adulthood. She was the sister whom the others worried about most. She was the sister who had paid the price the household had refused to acknowledge it was charging. The pretense of the household around her had been complete. Sophia, in the months before the birth, had been described as suffering from a digestive complaint that required a stay at the seaside. She had been attended by a doctor who had been chosen for his discretion and his willingness to write nothing down. The women of her household, the dressers and the maids, had managed her clothes around the changing shape of her body without ever appearing to notice. Her sisters had, in the way of sisters in a closed household, known and not known at the same time. The Queen had known. The King, in his own diminished condition by that summer, had been told a version that omitted the truth. The whole machinery of the castle had bent itself around the concealment of a single fact, and the fact had then been folded, over the years that followed, into the long silence that the family kept around all of its inconvenient truths. Sophia herself, in her old age at Kensington, was almost blind. She wrote letters that her attendants had to read back to her. She received her nephews and nieces, the children of her sisters and brothers, with a tenderness that the rest of the family understood and did not name. She sat for long hours in her chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, the small clock on the mantel marking out the hours. She had been, in her youth, the most fragile of the daughters. She remained in her old age the saddest. The boy she had borne and could not raise lived to read about her death in the newspaper. Amelia we have already lost. She died in 1810 at 27, the daughter who never made it out of the nunnery, and the daughter whose death broke the king. The household of women who had loved her, the older sisters who had played with her, Lady Charlotte Finch who had raised her, the Queen who had doted on her, all of them folded the loss of Amelia into the larger pattern of the family's grief. The loss of Amelia became, in some indirect sense, the loss of the whole sisterhood. The moment when the youngest had been taken, and the older sisters had understood that no rescue from the nunnery was going to come for them either. The princesses became, by the early 1810s, the next generation of court attendants. Their mother needed them. Their father required them. The household had work for them. the kind of work that had been done in earlier years by ladies of the bedchamber, except that the princesses, being daughters of the queen, did it without pay and without the option of resignation. They walked with their mother in the gardens, they sat with their mother at meals, they attended their father in his apartments, when he was well enough to receive them, and they attended their mother in hers when he was not. They were daughters, they were ladies, they were, in the most precise sense of the word, prisoners. And they were, in their own letters, increasingly aware of the shape of the trap. The letters they wrote to each other, in the years of their 30s and 40s, are the saddest documents in the family papers. They are full of small jokes and small kindnesses and small reports of the family's state. They are also full, between the lines, of a steady simmering resentment that the daughters could not direct openly at their parents because the love was real, the love was complicated, the love was the very thing that had kept them at home. The mother who held them was the mother who had loved them. They could not blame her without breaking themselves, so they did not blame her. They wrote about other things. They wrote about the weather. They wrote about new books. Charlotte loved them. There was never any doubt of that. The queen who walked with her daughters in the Windsor gardens in her old age was the same queen who had knelt on the nursery floor in the 1770s to admire a drawing of a horse that looked more like a dog. The love was continuous, and Charlotte, who could not have explained the trap to herself any more than her daughters could explain it in their letters, kept them. She kept them because the king's illness made their absence intolerable. She kept them because her own emotional life had narrowed in her late years to the daily presence of the women who had grown up around her. She kept them because, in the end, she did not know how to let them go. Both things were true. The love was true. The keeping was true. And the daughters in the rooms at Windsor, and in the carriages between Windsor and Kew, and in the apartments at Buckingham House, lived inside both truths at once, with a patience that the next generation of royal women would not match, with a patience that the 18th century had taught them to call obedience. The Queen died at Kew on the 17th of November in 1818. She was 74. She had been ill for some months, with a swelling in her legs that the doctors could not bring down, and a weakness in the chest that was getting steadily worse. She had moved to Kew, the smaller residence, in the autumn, because the castle had become too much for her. She was sitting up in her chair on the afternoon of the 17th, in her own apartments, with her son, the Prince Regent, at her side. He was holding her hand. She had asked him to. He had stayed with her through the morning. She closed her eyes for what she said would be a short rest. She did not open them again. The room she died in was a small one, on the ground floor of the lodge at Kew, with a window that gave onto the gardens she had known for half a century. The curtains had been drawn back, at her own request, so that she could see the trees. The trees in November were bare. The light coming through the window was the cold grey light of a late autumn afternoon. The fire in the grate was lit. The household had been gathered at Kew for the past several weeks, those of her women who had survived the long decades and who could still travel, and they had been in and out of her room for the days before her death, in the small, careful rotation that the dying queen had set herself. She had wanted to see each of them. She had given to each in the days before some small piece of her own jewellery or a small private letter, and she had received from each in turn the small farewell that the moment required. The household had wept in the corridors in the small, careful way that a great household weeps when a long reign is ending. The household had not wept in her room. She had not wished it. The Prince Regent had come down from London on the morning of the 17th in response to the message his mother had sent him. He had not been an attentive son in the years of her late life. He had been, in many of those years, a difficult one. He was, on the day of her death, 56 years old, and the man whose conduct had given her a great deal of the grief of her last decades. He was also, in that small room at Kew on that grey afternoon, a son. He had taken her hand because she had asked him to. He had not let it go. He had held her hand through the long, quiet hours of the early afternoon, while the breathing in the chair beside him slowed and at last became silence, and the small private fact of her death registered in the room before any of the others present had quite understood what had happened. He sat with her for some minutes before he allowed himself to weep. He sat for some minutes more before he could call the doctors in. The princesses, who had been waiting in the small drawing room next door, came in when they were called and stood around the chair. The hour was almost 5. The light at the window had almost gone. The candles were lit. The body was attended to by the women who had attended her body for half a century, in the small, careful rituals of preparation that the household had practiced and would practice now for the last time. The bell at Kew began to toll within the hour. The bell at Windsor began to toll soon after. The bells in London began to toll by the next morning. The country, which had not always loved her, mourned her with the steady decorum that the country owed to a queen who had been queen for 57 years. She had outlived almost everyone. Schwellenberg had been gone for 21 years. Lady Charlotte Finch had died in 1813, after a retirement spent quietly in her own house, with letters from the princesses arriving every week. Mrs. Delany had been gone for 30 years since 1788, the small house at Windsor that the king had given her standing empty for a long time afterwards. The Duchess of Ancaster had died in the 1790s. The Duchess of Hamilton, the second wife of 2 of the great peers of the kingdom, and one of the original women who had met the 17-year-old princess at Harwich, had died in 1790. The court that had been assembled around Charlotte in 1761 had dispersed by ones and twos across the decades, and Charlotte, in her last years, had been the last witness to the room she had walked into more than half a century earlier. She had also outlived her granddaughter, Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent, the only heir in the next generation of the line, had died in childbirth in November of the previous year. She had been 21. She had married the man she loved, the gentle Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, and the country had taken her to its heart in a way that it had not taken to any other royal in a generation. The pregnancy had been long and difficult. The labour had lasted 50 hours. The child, a boy, was stillborn. Princess Charlotte had survived the birth by a few hours and had then died of a hemorrhage that the doctors could not control. The country had wept for her in the streets. Her grandmother, who had loved her, had received the news at Bath and had not, in the year that followed, ever quite recovered from it. The line of succession that had seemed secure was suddenly open. The middle-aged sons of the king were married off in haste to produce an heir. The eventual answer would be a small girl named Victoria, born in 1819, the year after the Queen's own death. She would inherit the throne her grandmother had not lived to see her crowned upon. The granddaughter's death had affected the Queen in ways the household could see and ways it could not. She had been the heir of the next generation. She had been the small private hope that the Queen had carried in the long years of her late life for the continuation of the line. The hope had been taken in a single night by a labour that should not have ended as it ended, and by a hemorrhage that the medical practice of the period could not stop. The Queen, in the months that followed, had aged visibly. Her ladies had noticed it. Her daughters had noticed it. The Queen herself had not commented on it in any of the surviving correspondence, beyond the small, careful sentences in which she had recorded the death and her own grief in the formal phrases the position required. But she had, by the early months of 1818, begun to give away the small private possessions she had been keeping for her granddaughter. She had given the books. The giving away was the small private acknowledgement that no one in the household was expected to comment on. The Queen had accepted, in her own way, that the line she had given 15 children to extend had run, in the next generation, into a wall the household could not see past. The household dispersed. The princesses scattered, finally, into the lives that the nunnery had postponed. Augusta lived on at Clarence House. Elizabeth went to Hesse-Homburg with the husband she had married in the Queen's last summer, and ran her small German court with the practical efficiency she had always possessed, and was by every account contented. Mary remained with Gloucester at Bagshot, presiding over a household of her own that was, if not happy, at least hers. Sophia moved between Windsor and Kensington in her invalid retirement, in the long correspondence with the son she could not openly call her son. The princesses had been daughters and ladies and prisoners. They were now, finally, women in their own right, and the years they had left to them were the years their mother had not been able to give them while she was alive. Burney, by then Madame d'Arblay, had been living in Bath for some years. She received the news of the Queen's death, as she received most news now, in the post, and she recorded it in her diary in a brief and careful sentence that gave away nothing of what she felt. She would live another 22 years. The diary, which she had been editing in the long evenings since her resignation, would not be published in any complete form for decades after her own death in 1840. The reading public of the late 19th century would be the first to encounter the Queen's court as Burney had recorded it. The standing, the silences, the carriages with their open windows, the household table presided over by the German woman in her cruel decline, the Queen herself appearing in the room with the small thoughtful kindnesses that had made the position bearable. Every account of Charlotte's court that has been written since has rested on Burney's foundation. The novelist trapped in the gilded prison had been, in the end, the historian of it. Mary Hamilton, the woman who had managed the Prince of Wales, did not outlive Charlotte. She had died in 1816 in her own home at Cheadle 2 years before the Queen, with her cabinet of letters intact and her reputation untouched. The cabinet of letters passed to her daughter, and from her daughter to her granddaughter, and from the granddaughter to the public archives. The correspondence between the future king and the sub-governess he had not been able to bend to his will is now a public document, available to anyone who wishes to read it. The court dispersed in another sense as well. The household offices that Charlotte had built, the German keepers of the robes, the bedchamber ladies, the long staff of the working tier, were all inherited by the next queen. By Adelaide, the wife of William IV, and then by Victoria, who would become queen in 1837, and who would adapt the structure her grandmother had created to the very different requirements of her own long reign. The court presentations continued. The hooped petticoats and the lappets and the deep curtsy and the walk backwards from the throne remained as the Queen's grandmother had codified them, until Elizabeth II ended formal presentations at court in 1958. Charlotte's court outlived Charlotte by 140 years. The institution outlasted the woman. The nunnery is now a phrase in a footnote. The schoolroom at Buckingham House is now part of the public route through the modern palace. The lodge at Kew, where Charlotte died, is now a museum. The diaries are in the British Library. The letters from the Prince of Wales to Mary Hamilton are in a manuscript collection that scholars consult by appointment. Mrs. Delaney's paper mosaics are in the British Museum, where they are kept in a temperature-controlled cabinet, because the colours, after 2.5 centuries, are still preserved with a fidelity that the modern conservators find astonishing. The frogs are gone, the carriages are gone, the hoops and the powder and the feathers are in the costume collections of the museums, where they are taken out occasionally for scholarly consultation and admired and put back. The household that Charlotte had built, the household that defined her and that she defined, has receded into the documents and the objects. The women who served her have receded with it. The corridors at Windsor and at Buckingham House and at Kew have been redecorated, replumbed, rewired, repurposed until almost nothing remains of the rooms where the work was done. But the documents remain. The diaries, the letters, the household accounts, the wardrobe inventories, the lists of names and posts and salaries that the household kept with such precision, all of them are still there. Anyone who wishes to know what it was like to serve Queen Charlotte can know the standing, the carriages, the boredom, the kindness, the cruelty, the friendships, the grief, the pay which was modest, and the perquisites which were lavish, and the politics which were merciless, all of it preserved in the patient handwriting of the women who kept the records, ready to be read by anyone who comes to the archive with the time to give it. This was Queen Charlotte's court, not the throne room, not the coronation, not the public face of the monarchy, the private household, the working machinery, the women who held it together and who paid in their feet and their backs and their patience for the privilege of doing so, the duchess who adjusted the crown, the governess who invented the puzzle, the young woman who handled a future king with a skill the household never replaced, the German woman whose cruelty no one in the house could ever fully explain, the novelist who walked into the gilded room and walked out, 5 years later, with the diary that would shape every history of the place, the princesses who called Windsor a nunnery and who learned slowly that the love that kept them and the love that hurt them were the same love. The Queen herself, in her chair at Kew, with the Prince Regent holding her hand, closing her eyes for a rest, she said, would be short. If you enjoyed walking through the rooms of Queen Charlotte's household with the women who served her, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. There are more stories to tell, more lives to follow, more candles to light. And if you know someone who loves the world of Bridgerton, or who is fascinated by the real history of the Georgian court, please share this with them. Rest well tonight. The Queen is gone. The household is dispersed. The corridors at Windsor are quiet. The diaries are closed in their archive. The letters are folded in their cabinets. The dresses are folded in their tissue paper. The women who served her, the duchesses and the governesses and the gentlewomen and the German keepers and the wardrobe women and the maids of honour, have all of them long since gone home. The candle by the Queen's bed has been blown out. The clock in the corner is still ticking. The night is kind. Good night.